So, we have one little verse from the very end of chapter 21, which leads us into then the content we're looking at from chapter 22, and we're doing almost all of 22 except for the very last verse of 22. If you're looking at the chapter, you might say, well, it's not one or two paragraphs, so why are we covering almost the entire thing? Mainly because probably 2/3, nearly 3/4 of the chapter is a speech from Paul covering details which have been covered already as we've gone through the book of Acts. For those who weren't here in the kind of earlier chapters, about halfway through what we've studied up to thus far, I'll cover some of those details, but a lot of the actual specifics or the deeper exegesis of the content we've covered in previous sermons. And the content is also fairly straightforward. He's largely recounting recounting basically his life. Verses that goes all the way through to verse 21, and then verses 22 to 29 is kind of the response, and we'll cover that portion as well. Okay, verse 30, just like with the last chapter, then leads us into chapter 23. Right. So then in the next lesson we'll cover the relevant portions of chapter 23 while using verse 30 as the kind of bridging point. So let's begin in Acts 21, verse 40. And when he, referring to the Roman tribune, when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the stairs, motioned to the people with his hand. And when there was a great hush, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, saying, "Men, brothers, fathers, hear my defense which I now offer to you." And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even quieter. And he said, "I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, and having been brought up in this city, having been instructed at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strictness of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God just as you are all today, I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering both men and women into prisons, as also the high priest and all the council of the elders can testify. From them I also received letters to the brothers, and started off for Damascus in order to bring even those who were there to Jerusalem as prisoners to be punished. But it happened that as I was on my way, approaching Damascus, about noontime, a very bright light suddenly flashed from heaven all around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And I answered, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said to me, 'I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting.' And those who were with me beheld the light, to be sure, but they did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, 'What should I do, Lord?' And the Lord said to me, 'Rise up and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that has been determined for you to do.' But since I could not see because of the glory of that light, being led by the hand of those who were with me, I came into Damascus. Now a certain Ananias, a man who was devout by the standard of the law, and well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me. And standing near, he said, 'Brother Saul, regain your sight.' And at that very hour I regained my sight and saw him. And he said, 'The God of our fathers has appointed you to know his will, and to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to all men of what you have seen and heard. Now why do you delay? Rise up and be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling upon his name.' Now it happened that when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, that I fell into a trance, and I saw him saying to me, 'Hurry up and get out of Jerusalem, quickly, because they will not accept your witness about me.' And I said, 'Lord, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another I used to imprison and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I also was standing and approving, and guarding the garments of those who were slaying him.' And he said to me, 'Go, for I will send you far away from the Gentiles.' And they were listening to him up to this statement, And then they raised their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live." And as they were crying out and throwing off their garments and tossing dust into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by flogging so that he might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. And when they stretched him out with leather straps, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported to him, saying, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman." The commander came to him and said, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And he said, "Yes." And the commander answered, "I acquired this citizenship with a large sum of money." And Paul said, "But I have been born a citizen." Therefore those who were about to examine him immediately withdrew from him. And the commander who was afraid when he was and the commander also was afraid when he learned that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. Give me 1 second.
Sorry, we were late.
No, it's okay. I'm just going to close that other door over.
Met our daughter while we were here, so we got talking.
Yeah, that's all good. Alrighty. So, we are in bulk covering the vast majority of chapter 22, all the way down to second last verse, verse 29. As I stated in the intro, the majority of this is this speech which Paul gives before the riotous mob of the Jews there in Jerusalem. Many of the details we've covered going throughout the book of Acts. He's recounting essentially the short, quick version of his life, more or less, especially following the incident at Damascus, all the way back in those middle portion chapters. And so I'll provide commentary as we go through, but again, it won't be a deep exegesis because we've done that deeper exegesis in those previous chapters. But then, of course, the response comes in verses 22 to 29, which is some more substance in there. So, as it says in verse 40, let's begin. So when he had given him permission, Paul was standing on the stairs, motioning to the people with his hand, and when there was a great hush, he spoke over them in the Hebrew language. Right? So it's Hebrew, and again, verse 2 also mentions that he's speaking in Hebrew. So he begins by saying in verse 1 of chapter 22, "Men, brothers, and fathers, hear my defense, which I now offer to you." And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even quieter. Part of this was pointed out in a passing question last week from Lisa about him switching into Hebrew. Elements of that crowd would have understood him, elements would not have. Certainly, at least those nearby to him are probably filled with some of the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and those of the Sanhedrin, right? The Jewish council who had probably been the ones who were the ones leading this riot and been dragging him to the steps and been following him and leading the crowd all the way to the fortress itself. And so they would have definitely understood Hebrew. How much of the rest of the crowd would have understood the Hebrew would vary depending on who we're talking about here. I've explained this before. Hebrew is outside of the context of the temple and the synagogue. Hebrew is functionally dead, at least in terms of common parlance. The Jews for a couple of centuries at this point had been speaking Aramaic, the Western dialect here. Some of them would have known Greek if they were merchants and traders, and if they had business relationships with with people from around elsewhere in the empire, around the world. But nevertheless, him addressing them in Hebrew is for the specific purpose of showing his qualification and acumen, the kind of which he addresses first off here.
Is that the same as Hebrew, Aramaic?
No, they're similar. It's kind of like the relationship between English and Dutch or English and German. It's part of the.
It says Aramaic in my
In which verse?
40.
Okay, interesting. No, it would definitely be a reference to Hebrew. I'll go and check exactly, but yeah, if it's interesting if it does. Let's have a look. Yeah, no, it's definitely Hebrew. Evreithi, in Greek, Hebrew. So yes, the reason why, and for the purpose of him speaking Hebrew, is to show his education, and he mentions that pretty much off the bat in verse 3. Hebrew and Aramaic are related, but they're different. They're different languages. There's some mutual intelligibility between the two. Kind of like how if you listen to, if an English speaker listens to Dutch or to German, they'll recognise some similarities, or even especially these days. I say these days, for the last 1,000 years since the Norman conquest of England in 1066, there are French words that people often recognise in English as loan words or those things. Yeah, but no, Hebrew and Aramaic are different languages, but closely related. So in verse 3, he begins, I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, and we've pointed out on the maps where that is, right, slightly northwest of Antioch. Born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but having been brought up in this city, having been instructed at the feet of Gamaliel according to the strictness of the law of our fathers. The Rabbi Gamaliel was the preeminent rabbinical teacher of the first century and of this time period. He features briefly back before Paul becomes the focus. He features back in, I think, chapter 5, somewhere around there, when Peter and John get arrested in the temple complex. Gamaliel advises the Sanhedrin to release Peter and John. With good wisdom, he says, if they're not of God, then God will strike them down. If they are of God, they will be protected. Which is a good attitude to have. But nevertheless, Paul was educated in the school of Hillel. Hillel was Gamaliel's father, and Gamaliel was the son. Gamaliel was the preeminent rabbinical teacher. Paul was educated in that particular school, which was the most elite of the rabbinical schools in the first century. There is another student. He's widely considered, even in the first century, among the Jews, and again, the earlier portions of Acts make this plain and apparent. He's considered to be one of the best, if not the best, and most capable or most talented in his generation. There is another fellow, this comes from other extra-biblical historical sources, Josephus particularly, who was a first century Jewish historian. There was another gentleman who was in the same generation or same class as Paul, who was kind of, he and Paul were the two most capable of the students there. Much of what he goes on to do is foundational to the Talmud and to Judaism even to this day, whereas Paul becomes foundational in many respects to the continuation of the faith, of the true faith. And so it's an interesting little historical tidbit, but nevertheless, he's referencing his acumen for the purpose of showing, again, the things that actually matter to them. There are environments in which touting your qualifications is largely an act of pride and hubris. There are also circumstances in which explaining your qualifications or acumen is actually something that's useful and necessary. My educational background again, I don't have a PhD, but my educational background lends credence to the fact that I hopefully know what I'm talking about. at least to a degree. At least it demonstrates at the bare minimum that I have invested time in what I'm talking about, and so I'm not just simply how would you frame it? I'm not just simply parroting something I read on the internet or I watched a YouTube video or what happens to be, right? I can, at least functionally speaking, point to nearly a decade of theological and academic backgrounds, right? Which doesn't guarantee that I'm correct, but it does lend credence to the fact that I maybe have a decent chance of being correct. And so when someone's trying to assess, hey, does this guy know what he's talking about? I can, at least pointing to the academic background, doesn't conclude that I am correct. It just means that it changes the scope of whether I am or not. It's no different than listening to my opinion about medical things versus your opinion about medical things. No one should choose to listen to me about medical things. They should choose to listen to you on medical things. Whatever the context happens to be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this would go for any occupation or job. And so here he's pointing to this also for the fact that, again, and this is kind of part of the hypocrisy in one sense, I suppose. Qualifications and acumen doesn't guarantee that someone's right at all. And in fact, simply pointing to someone's expertise, real or otherwise, in a field, and pointing to that as the evidence that they're true is actually, it is logically fallacious in the first place. It's an appeal to authority fallacy. So in other words, go ahead.
But there is the perennial problem where someone will be quoted as a doctor or an expert, but they're actually speaking outside their field of expertise,
Yes.
and it's really just an opinion.
No, correct. Yes, correct. Exactly. And so the expertise, exactly. That's one way in which an appeal to authority fallacy, as it's referred to in technical terms, is perpetrated. So many of the prominent atheists of the last 20 years, for example, speak so widely and flagrantly beyond their actual realm of expertise that, whilst also promoting what they're saying based on their qualifications. So the archetypical example of this would be like a figure like Richard Dawkins, probably the most famous, most prominent of the new atheists of the last 20 years. He, by academic education or qualification, he is a biologist, and specifically a zoologist, but has worked in the fields of evolutionary biology. But much of his popularization of atheism is of course well beyond the realms of the scientific field of biology, where you're talking about philosophy, you're talking about theology and other such fields that he's not qualified in at all, right? So the issue isn't, he's not qualified, therefore he's 100% wrong. The reason why I'd argue he's wrong is different reasons. The issue is the fact that such people promote themselves as being knowledgeable or having some concept of expertise because they have a PhD in something, but that something's not the actual subject that they're talking about. Right?
When people quote to me, such and such, who's an expert,
Yep.
has said such and such, I usually ask, what's his field of expertise?
Yep.
And is he speaking outside that field?
Yep, and we see, correct, exactly, and we see that all the time on a whole host of issues. So, like, even during COVID, there were people who were speaking to that who you could legitimately class as experts in epidemiology or virology generally, and then there was 1,000 other people who are not experts at all. And this comment would be understood easily. So being a general practitioner broadly doesn't then guarantee expertise in one thing or another when it comes specifically to virology. It's a much higher advantage than a schmuck like me who has no medical background at all. And so, like I'm saying, there's layers, right? There's degrees. But it's no different than it's a failure to understand how specialization can actually get in a given field, right?
There's also just like, we watched a thing just last night on a Leonardo da Vinci painting that came out of nowhere. It's a painting of Jesus, actually.
Yeah, I know the one you're referring to, yep.
You know the one?
Yep.
Which apparently the Prince of Saudi Arabia now has, which is interesting, because I don't know where he's going to show it, because they're not allowed to show pictures of prophets. Or anyway, yeah. I don't know where, but there were experts in that too. Top experts in their field, but one expert would say one thing and the other expert would say something else. So there's also, you're going to, even though you might have a handful of people that are top in their area. They may not necessarily all agree on.
Well, there's always disagreement, even in intellectual circles.
No,
Yeah,
well,
and
there's
should be.
especially discriminating intellectual
Yeah,
circles.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
not even that there's just, there's especially. There's
As an
especially.
interesting example, when our father-in-law fell over and he had a skin tear, we took him to his doctor, and the doctor says, "Oh no, we don't do bandaging. That's what the nurse does. Take him to a nurse."
Yeah, he may never have bandaged anything. Yeah.
Actually, he's right. Skin tears are better.
Yeah, there's the practical.
Doctors do great things, but nurses have skin tears. That's like breathing to us.
No, correct.
I love doing skin tears. You should have brought him to me. I love them.
But that's the nature. That's the nature of knowledge. Yeah.
The doctor's saying, "This is outside my expertise."
Yeah. But then,
Exactly.
but then you get nurses that think they're doctors as well, you know. So
Yeah, I know,
you
and
get
that's
it
where, exactly. That's where,
We do, like-
those things are a constant interplay. This goes to every single last field of any. It doesn't matter what area you could point to.
Yeah,
Everything
skin
would.
tears, though.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, everything is a balance between the constant war between pride and humility, right? So exactly. So for example, my knowledge of Greek as in ancient Greek of particularly and specifically Koine Greek, and then to lesser degrees other earlier forms of Greek, can probably at best be described as intermediate. It would be flagrantly irresponsible for me to describe it as advanced. It's definitely not beginner. I have years and years now of knowledge in working with it, and I can offer opinions to a degree. No one should ask me to give a legitimate academic translation of the New Testament. Right? So that's recognizing the level. Okay. My Hebrew is nowhere near as good as my Greek. And that's mainly just because Greek was my focus academically at college, and it's been my interest generally because of my classical education in high school. So Greco-Roman culture was something that I was already more familiar with anyway. So then recognizing that, so then someone coming to me and saying, "Hey, how should we be translating this complex sentence here in the Greek?" I could maybe offer an opinion like on a word. But no one should be asking me about a legitimate professional translation of the entire sentence. If it's a complex one, if it's a regular sentence, of course I can translate it. But I'm talking about academic debate opinions is what I'm referring to.
But how's your Westie Australian, mate?
Yeah, exactly. Well, yes, that depends if it's legible or not, because sometimes Greek is more legible. So there's degrees of expertise, and so why is this important to point out? Because authority is a natural component of the world. Hierarchy is a part of the created order of God's world. Heaven itself is clearly presented as hierarchical. There's no confusion as to where the angels stand in relation to God. Heaven's not a democracy. Heaven, no one's asking the host of heaven as to what God's views on X, Y, and Z should actually be or not.
We treat them as if they are sort of like co-equal with God. Some people, the angel worship.
Yeah, I suppose in many respects, it depends. Yeah, and that varies widely. But yeah, I can see what you mean. Yeah, so there's a natural hierarchy and an ordering to things, as there is in the world. The scriptures very clearly explain the hierarchy in the natural world of the relationship, say between, even just using big categories, between man and between the animals. There is no sense in which we are a part, just one rung on the ladder of the animal kingdom. The animal kingdom is something that is ontologically separate from human beings. Part of our being made imago Dei, or in the image of God, an image that's been shattered and needs to be repaired through redemption, but an image that was certainly there in Adam and Eve, is part of that distinction. Furthermore, attempts to overthrow or cast off or do away with that hierarchy or that authority are fool's errands. This is why, even to use very easy low-hanging fruit examples, this is the one of the many great follies of Marxism as a political philosophy or an economic philosophy, especially as realized in communism, casting off of the authority of the church or the authority of the state, which ironically can only be enforced through a very powerful centralized state, as in the example of the Soviet Union. But anyway, but that part aside, that hypocrisy and irony aside, yeah. This utopian kind of vision of everyone living in some Arcadian paradise where everyone is just on the exact same level and we're all the same, and this kind of radical egalitarian notion as seen in the French Revolution and to a lesser degree the American Revolution and other such times.
When H.G. Wells came to Australia, he says, the Australians are too egalitarian, they're too utopian.
Yeah.
I'd much rather go back to Britain.
Yeah, well, he did too. Yes, good point. Part of that is the colonial, is the convict element of the colonial part, and so the freedom from that, there is a jailhouse element to it, I guess. But yes, authority and
He didn't like it.
no. Well, British society has flourished.
But he wrote all those stories.
Well, yeah, he's dead too. Yeah, that's a good point. Oh, that's the complexity of people, isn't it? Part of this is so that we can understand what's being done here. The very same Apostle Paul is the same one in whose epistles says that he doesn't boast in his own acumen, or he counts all. In fact, he is the one who also goes on to say that he counts all of his previous achievements and talents and acumen as nothing in comparison to the glory of Christ and everything else he goes on to describe. But at the same time, he's also more than intelligent enough to realise that he had this background and acumen that God had ordained as part of his life, and that he was then going to use as tools for good, not for evil. Right?
Sorry, Daniel, did you say that the dude, this how did you say his name?
Gamaliel.
Was he part of the Talmud? Like, did I hear that?
No, what I was saying was that so Josephus, who's a first century historian at this time, he accounts that there was another student alongside Paul, and that he and Paul were kind of basically the best in their class, in their generation. And much, I need to go. It's been a couple of years since I looked. So I can't remember his name, but. The other gentleman is the one who then became very foundational in a lot of the teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees surviving beyond the destruction of Jerusalem. Those two classes.
Last week, he said, I remember his name last week, I think.
I might have.
It's okay.
If I was talking about him, but anyway, I can't remember off the top of my head. But point being is that he goes on to become very influential, not singularly, but very influential in the survival of a lot of the teachings that then go on to become instrumental in the Talmud. The Talmud ultimately is essentially the formalization of the Pharisaical and Sadduceical teachings that have been building over the course of centuries, the kind of which we're encountering in the gospel, which you encounter in the Gospels. So whenever you see Jesus arguing with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, more so the Pharisees than the Sadducees, but both of them, a lot of those beliefs that they're espousing is what then gets inculcated in that. Him pointing to his qualifications and acumen is not to point to the fact that guarantees that he's correct. What it means is he's pointing to it because he knows full well that it will result in the Jews here actually giving him the light of day. Or the time of day, sorry. They'll actually, as you see there, right, when you start speaking in Hebrew, they become even quieter, verse 2, right?
Would it also nullify the accusation that he's going against the Jewish tradition and
Correct. So part of that would be I'm one of the most qualified and talented rabbis in the world
of my time,
of my generation. Yeah. And also keeping in mind that he's not 20-something anymore. He's not 30. He's probably 50 plus or minus. So most of the people he's speaking to are younger than him here, across the group. So he's using it not as an appeal to authority, but rather as a demonstration of his authority in order to have them listen. It's no different than how. It's the same. It's partly also in one sense a condemnation. That's not the primary purpose because they're not even remotely interested in evaluating whether or not he's actually correct on the details that are being spoken of. They're not concerned with the truth here, but they're willing to listen to him because he started speaking in Hebrew, which means he doesn't even need to. They automatically would know that he's a rabbi because he's speaking Hebrew, and only the rabbis and teachers can speak Hebrew. And so now they're listening to him with like an element of reverence in one sense, like not like full blown like, oh yes, please teach. But they came quieter, right? They're oh, he's a right. So you just tried to kill him, but now you're going to listen to him because he started speaking Hebrew. Priorities. But anyway, so I'll start again in verse 3. I am a Jew born in Tarsus, Cilicia, but having been brought up in this city and having been instructed at the feet of Gamaliel according to the strictness of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God just as you all are today, I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering both men and women into prisons, as also the high priest and all the council of the elders can testify. The way is one of the references to Christianity, taken from Christ's words, I am the way, the truth and the life. Right?
That's incredible credit that he's got that. Even the high priest and the elders amongst you know who I am. I grew up here.
Yeah, correct. Yep. All pointing out those same things. The council of the elders, the Sanhedrin, and so in other words, the whole Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Levites, the high priest himself, etc. It's a different high priest in these days than it was in earlier on, but either way, still though it's his son. From them I also received letters to the brothers, and started off for Damascus in order. So basically, like warrants, in other words. If this was during the age of sale, and it was talking about piratical behaviour, we call it letters of marque. For also received letters from the brother and started off for Damascus in order to bring even those who were there to Jerusalem as prisoners to be punished.
So can I just so received letters to the brothers? Is that like warrants for their arrests? Is that, or what does that mean?
Yes, warrants to then
Yep.
execute a raid on the Christians in Damascus. Yeah, that gets covered in some of those other chapters.
It'll keep the Romans happy.
Well, I'm working it's not right now. Yeah. Verse 6. But it happened that I was on my way approaching Damascus about noontime, and a very bright light suddenly flashed from heaven all around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Again, he's just essentially recounting the kind of things that we see in the early chapters here in the book, earlier on. And I answered, who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting.
It's interesting you use the word Lord.
Sir. It says sir in mine.
Sir is an okay translation. It's not terribly inaccurate, but yeah, Lord would be the most direct. So he does, well, again, he would be the first reference to Lord. I've kind of explained this before. So Lord in Greek has a variety of contextual usages, so its semantic range is varied. What that means is that the paterfamilias, the father of the family, would be referred to using that term Kyrios, or Lord. A commander in a military context could also be referred to as a Kyrios, Lord. Public officials are referred to Kyrios, Lord, right? So, but also Kyrios is the term that's used in the New Testament or among the Christians in Greek to describe God, right?
It means, but does that mean he thought he was actually talking to a god or a god at that time?
That would require an act of clairvoyance.
I'm sorry about that.
But broadly, he's using this term Kyrios to in an obvious sense, because all of a sudden there's this gigantic bright light, and he hears a voice and sees a person booming from the sky above him, and so
his natural assumption is that there's some.
He's not talking to his next door neighbour.
Yeah. Or someone with a bright floodlight.
Yeah. So part of that would be it's a term of respect.
Okay, it's respect. Okay.
Well, it's recognising this person here, me here. Yeah. So who are
he's
you?
in awe of some way. Or like,
Yeah, exactly. It's not like this is him immediately recognizing it's no, he doesn't immediately recognize. It's not the issue. So I ask, who are you? I am Jesus the Nazarene, right? Or in other words, Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. And those who were with me beheld the light, to be sure, but they did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. Again, this comes up in those chapters as well. They see this because they fall off their horses. The horses obviously freak out, which would be expected. They fall off their horses go wild. They don't. What this literally means, that again, because the term, like the literal term here is to not understand, is to not be able to make sense of.
So they would have been hearing the noise and seeing the light.
Well, yeah. Hearing, because it's not like, it's kind of like, it's like how the scriptures use the reference at times, the figure of speech. Those who have ears to hear, let them hear. Mm-hmm. Well, we all have ears. The question's not about literally is sound going into your cochlea. The issue is over listening, understanding. That's what hear in that context means. So it's not that did they literally hear or not the voice. No, they did. But they didn't understand what was being said.
But they were witnessing that it wasn't a hallucination. That Paul wasn't having a hallucination.
No, he wasn't anyone who saw this.
That was the real event.
No, because the horses freak and they fall off their horses and they all start panicking. Yeah, and so yes, you're correct. So it's not just Paul. Like his soldiers with him saw all this happen. Verse 10, and I said, what should I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, rise up and go into Damascus, and there you will be told of all that has been determined for you to do. Again, this is all quotations at this point. But since I could not see because of the glory of the light, being led by the hand by those who were with me, I came to Damascus, right? He was blinded by this light. And we've covered that in those deeper chapters, what that all means. But that whole point was the important symbolism of Paul actually, again, Paul who thinks of himself as educated and reasoned and enlightened and knowledgeable, right? Knowledge associated with light and with the eyes particularly, right? The eyes throughout various human cultures throughout history is associated with the soul or with the will, right? Seeing and knowing are two things which are held in tandem philosophically and theologically in history. And so, when we sing Amazing Grace, I was blind, but now I see, right? That's taken as a reference from Paul's stuff here.
Deepfake AI pictures now, it's totally destroyed.
Well, yeah, it's a tangential point, but yeah, it's a good point. The part of the darkness, part of the darkness of our time is the utilization now of technology, which is exponentially increasing in its capabilities to be able to deceive visually.
Voice and vision. You can absolutely, totally fake someone and the words they say.
Voice has been around for longer, so the technology is more developed. The visuals, are getting more and more terrifying by the day. And so then the difference between being able to actually believe what you're seeing is something which is rapidly evaporating.
Yeah.
Apart from the fact that when you see a 30-second news clip anyway, there's 1,000 points of context which the average person's missing. And that's before you even begin to talk about any other legitimate factors of how the world tends to operate anyway. Which
just
the
the idea of seeing and knowing as they had in that time,
correct.
In our time, has been eroded quite severely. What you see doesn't necessarily.
Yeah, correct, and that's why. And I think I made this point. I think I made this point back when we covered in that chapter. But even if I did or didn't, I'll make it here again. That's why having a more sophisticated understanding of what's meant by the term faith is really important. Mm-hmm. So what I mean by that is that the common trope, as has been for probably 100 years now, nearly, being that, especially kind of in the modern intellectualism of our time, is the kind of cartoonish portrayal of faith as basically kind of just what a kid does with regards to Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny, right? blind, acquiescent assumption, and basically kind of just sticking your fingers in your ear and closing your eyes and just wishing for the best, right?
Weirdly enough, I just watched a YouTube channel called C.S. Lewis Doodles,
Okay.
and it was talking about exactly that, what the layperson's...
Oh, C.S. Lewis addressed this risk extensively.
Yeah, but it's very technical.
It's extremely technical, yeah.
Yeah, defining belief and faith.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, and those terms can be used interchangeably in English. It just depends on how we're using them. And but faith, the concept of faith, not just in terms of semantics of how we get it from the Latin word fide, but the concept contains within it a sense of integral to that definition is the concept of trust, but nowhere at all in here, in any of the wisdom literature or even elsewhere, anywhere at all, is the concept of trust ever portrayed as being, or as being, as if it should be blind and unthinking.
That's
So
the secular world's depreciation of
of understanding. Yeah, but you're correct. Yes, and so why is that worth pointing out? Those who have a shallow understanding of what constitutes belief or faith or whichever of those two words you'd like to use are quite frankly spiritually probably not going to survive for the next 100 years. They having a shallow understanding of faith or belief renders you incapable of actually standing firmly against lies and deception. So as I've explained many times, that that the basis of my trust for the rest of this book is predicated on a whole assortment and series of things that are justifiable and verifiable, right? So I have not one iota of an ability to demonstrate that the story of Jonah happened. Okay.
Well, you've actually got more reason to believe it didn't happen on current anatomy of whales that we have today.
If we assume it's a whale, yeah.
Yes.
The text uses this term of a large fish, but that could constitute a variety of things. But either way, so like there are things that we know. So Nineveh is known to be a real city. That's indisputable. The various places that get mentioned, we know exactly where a number of those, not all, but we know a number of those places are. There's a whole host of things in there that are very real and verifiable in terms of history and archaeology. There's also things like him being devoured by a large creature in the sea, and then essentially, functionally speaking, dying and rising. What that means in the context of Jonah is a whole other story. But so I don't have like archaeological evidence that I can point to, right? But that's not the question, because the question is I can point to all the other areas that I do have the ability to verify archaeologically, historically, philosophically, etc. And I trust that the very same author who wrote that also wrote that, and that's the base. So the basis actually, ironically, is not in human beings. The basis of trust is actually, it's the same thing as even something as seemingly trivial. It's not trivial at all, but seemingly trivial of Jesus walking on the water, right? So I have no what's called experiential knowledge, right? Which is not the sum total of knowledge, but as the name suggests, it's knowledge that you've acquired through personally experiencing a given event, right? Trivial example is every single one of us here have very clear experiential knowledge that sitting in a seat results in you not collapsing to the floor outside of the chair being broken, right? When every single one of you came in here, you unthinkingly pulled out the chair and sat down, right? Because of an entire lifetime of experiential knowledge. Following? Okay. Experiential knowledge is not invalid. It's important in certain contexts, but one of the core mistakes of our day and the lies, quite frankly, is that knowledge is only legitimate if it's experiential knowledge, right? So this is why, for example, the atheists laugh at the concept of someone walking on, the story of Jesus walking on water. Oh, that couldn't have happened. Why? Because people can't walk on water. Right, so you can see the equation going through their head. I have no personal experience, in the place of the atheist, I have no personal experience of ever walking on water or seeing someone walk on water. Ergo, it can't happen.
It's like the Jews crossing the Red Sea. Oh yes, there's certain times a year when it's only a couple of inches deep, but it says in the Bible as if on dry ground.
Yep.
Firstly, and secondly, if it was only a couple of inches of water, how did the whole Egyptian army drown in a
Yeah, correct. That's why trying to come to those arguments is not the issue. The argument is, I mean, there's a land bridge that runs through the Gulf of Aqaba, about halfway up.
But it does say, it says actually that there was a wall of water on the right. No, it's very...
And God also used
lead you to think that there was a like a creek that they were crossing.
No, okay. But that ironically is what's going on there is that's ironically Christians actually using the same faulty logic that atheists or non-Christians are trying to use. So it's using an erroneous tool to try and combat an erroneous tool, and that's a problem. So I have zero experiential knowledge in someone walking on water, right? What I do have though is every bit of philosophical knowledge and theological knowledge that I could ever need to arrive not just at the conclusion that Jesus walking on water happened, but that it's actually it is rational and logical to believe that he did, by virtue of the fact that walking on water is an exorbitantly easier task than creating the entire subatomic structure of the universe.
Oh yeah. And also the proof that it was actually water and it was deep water was that Peter sank.
Yes, correct, yes. And so basically it's the same thing with the resurrection. Basically you have to kind of eventually arrive at the conclusion, very, very conveniently, that every single person in and around this story 2,000 years ago was lying, but that you, for some reason, 2,000 years later, are the one who has it correct.
That's so much hubris.
That's my point. That's the whole issue. It's all eventually an issue of pride, right? Not just because someone in ancient times said it, therefore no, that's not the issue. It's the same arrogant skepticism that basically, if you go into any history department, and it depends on different fields, because you can also talk about archaeology, which has elements of history, obviously, as well. But if you go to any history department at any major university in the West now, and ask them about any assortment of stories that we get historically throughout history, especially ancient history, you'll be lucky to find anyone that actually believes that almost any of it happened. Right? I'm saying that hyperbolically, but that's kind of what it is. Did anything in the Iliad with regards to the Trojan War happen? No, it's a myth. Any of the stories from ancient? No, that's a myth. Any of the stories from ancient Egypt? No, it's a myth. We know the pyramids existed, but anything about how it was built? No, that's a myth. Are any of the stories from ancient Tyre?
Real historians of that time?
But that's because that's the air of it. It's the arrogance of it. So it's the same.
Okay.
It's
they found Troy.
They found Troy, yeah.
Exactly, but that's what happens though. But all that's exactly what happens. What happens is and I say this because I care about history, not because I hate it. But the issue is because of the blindness of their own arrogance and their hubris and their pride. It's this group. It's the club. It's the group think type of thing. So it's in vogue to be uber skeptical about just about everything, because it's also partly driven by the fact that of our cultural view that we are the smartest human beings who've ever lived because we have computers and rockets.
Yeah,
right?
just look at the anti-Kitra device. We are not smart at all.
Yeah, and that's also the blindness of the arrogance. So it's like, I'll use like very specific examples without taking much time. Like, so Egyptology as a field is one of the most guilty of this. Egyptology on an academic level now functionally is practically a cult. It's got gatekeepers at every single possible entrance, and the only thing that is or isn't known is that we have no idea how the pyramids were built. Right? Outside of that, everything else is a matter of even raising a hypothesis almost is anathema. So at the same time as people.
So how can you progress in science if you don't raise a hypothesis?
Well, you can't. No, but you can't and you don't. That's why all this is failing, because it's all been done outside the Christian context.
Okay.
So all these things which arose in the scientific age because of Christianity, now you have hosts of non-Christians doing it, and it's all decaying right in front of us.
Okay.
So it's why Egyptology hasn't progressed one iota in like 100 years.
Wow.
It's why quantum mechanics has been stagnant basically since like Einstein.
I thought we were making some progress there, particularly in quantum computing.
Quantum computing, sure, but other broader fields like, say, string theory, for example.
Yeah, we haven't gone far there.
We haven't got
Or
any, we haven't got any,
entanglement.
we haven't got any of those things, because all those things, and this is not to make it too complex, the point I'm trying to draw here is because it is the blindness, is this whole concept of sight and of knowledge and of blindness.
So
Is
science is rotting from the inside out, essentially then.
Correct. Even fields like biology, there are conferences being held around the world now saying that neo-Darwinianism has failed. We need to come up with a new theory.
Oh,
But that's the thing now.
Has failed to come up with
a new
Well,
theory.
a new theory.
Well, yeah. So, like, the biggest issues right now in evolutionary biology is that basically neo-Darwinianism, which is the major theory of evolution as far has been since Darwin's day. Obviously, I would reject it for 1,000 reasons, but even among atheists, on the academic level, they're finding way too many problems with it, like, for example, the complete lack of evidence in transitional fossils between species,
Still doing nothing for those, yeah.
all those kind of things. The issue, the entire dilemma of what's called the Cambrian explosion, where basically there's a whole bunch of nothing, and then all of a sudden a bunch of animals start appearing.
And there's God
Kind of like it says in Genesis 1. Anyway, and so it's called the Cambrian explosion and blah blah blah. And so all these things are massive
They don't
problems.
know why. They have no idea why.
No idea why, other than that it definitely wasn't God. All especially in things like genetics, the fact that 100 years ago what we knew about genetics was, well, basically nothing, basically
Yeah,
zero.
pretty much.
And then now we've mapped the human genome, functionally speaking, and we now have the ability to look even all the way down to the cellular and molecular levels. And we realise that basically our bodies are just literally machines.
Incredibly complex.
Be-
And the
ri-
deeper you go, the more
Ridiculous levels, yeah, so exactly. So the evolution of these various things.
And we thought it was all DNA, now we know it's RNA.
No, correct. And which one came first?
Yeah.
Because they're both actually required, and one kind of existed out the other.
Yeah,
So it's almost like they had to be created at the same time.
yeah.
Or the fact that you have entire mechanisms in our organs which have, they're complexes of 30 different proteins that none of the mechanisms work when it's 29 or 28 or 27.
And they've got to be folded just in a
They have to be,
particular way.
they have to be
The
30.
origami of a folded protein.
Yeah, and so how could it evolve from 1 up to 30 when every single model, 29, 28, 27 proteins,
Wouldn't work.
it dies immediately?
Yeah.
So it had to be 30 or nothing.
Or mitochondria, how come we now have mitochondria?
Right. But
which
so this is the
a-
point.
A separate organism.
So the point is, and this is the whole point I'm trying to draw here, and this is my whole point about pride and about sight and about light and understanding. Modern Western man in his atheism, who professes himself to be the wisest and most knowledgeable creature, who's finally cast off the shackles of religion, ends up actually being dumber and more incorrect than an Israelite peasant 3,500 years ago.
Yeah.
Because they're following their own
Correct.
glory or
Their own knowledge separated from divine
The
revelation.
more easily deceived, the more easily, basically trapped.
Yep. So exactly.
Cults and things.
They
Yeah.
believe their own hype.
Yeah, and so but that's part of, and so that's why, and again, that's how you make sense, by the way, of phrases like, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. God uses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, right? When he says to the Pharisees, I've come to bring sight to the blind, but those who see will be blinded. Right. So on the surface, if you don't understand the complexity of that phrase that he's using, you'll think, well, if he's come to bring sight to the blind, and they already see, why would he make them then blind? You're not understanding the figurative or symbolic nature of the language, right? Those who are blind, he will give sight to. But those who see, they don't actually really see, they think they see. They profess to be ones who see, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, whereas he calls them blind men all the time. Those who see, not in reality, but those who think they see, they will be blinded.
It's like people who,
In other words, they'll be judged.
who read the Bible and go, oh, it's an interesting fairy tale story. I didn't really get much out of it. That's because they're blinded. They don't see.
No, they don't blind, they don't see it, and that's why this is going to be part of the subject on Sunday. And so I'll explain. This is actually one of the central points I'm making on Sunday about we're on the 9th commandment against false witness or lying. And part of this will be about the nature of understanding and the nature of, because one of the key problems that comes out of the Enlightenment is of 200-300 years ago is that intellectuals in Europe, particularly France and Germany, and then later on England, were engaging in these kinds of fields, very deep, complex fields of philosophy and its various forms, right? So logic, metaphysics, epistemology elsewhere, and theology. And they were doing so purely upon the basis of human reasoning, which is a gift that every one of us has. It's part of our being made in the image of God. But they were doing it completely detached from divine revelation, in other words. This. And so not just this is in the book, but this as a living, again, the word of God being living, right? So the scriptures are described as being the sword of the Spirit in Ephesians 6, for example, right? Which is the word of God. That's what Ephesians 6 says. And so that's why it's described as living and active, right? Because it's written by God through human agency, because that's how God operates. He operates through material means, because we're not Gnostics. And so the issue going on in the Enlightenment is you have these two major schools, the rationalist and the empiricist schools, right? But the human reason, and we're using logic and blah, blah, blah. But it was completely detached from divine revelation. And that's why you get basically this kind of concept. It's also where these concepts of egalitarian notions and equalitarian notions come from, and the rise of modern democracies and republics come out of that. But all of that based on the view that basically, like John Locke said, human beings are tabula rasa, we're blank slates, right? And then if we become corrupted, it's because of human systems, right? So we're not actually, so it's a denial of original sin, it's a denial of the fall, it's a denial of all these things in Genesis and elsewhere. So it's not actually biblical, right? That's the problem.
So you basically, instead of, you just point, everyone just keeps pointing the finger and...
Well, if someone's become, and you see the consequences of this side. It's not only Locke, it's especially Jean-Jacques Rousseau, it's Voltaire, it's a whole host of other figures. But anyway, you see the consequences of that now, right? So one of the biggest children of that concept is the modern fields of psychology and psychiatry. Okay, which I have, and it's not against the people. I'm talking about the fields. I have little to no respect for the basis that that every single thing that's wrong in someone's life is pathologized. Yeah. Right. So someone who gets violent and angry and doesn't discipline themselves, they're not controlled, right? They lash out, blah blah. Oh, he has intermittent explosive disorder. No, he's just a violent, angry guy. No, he's just sinning. Like it's not. It's a pathology. No, it's not a pathology.
That is psychopathy, though, to being violent and self-centered.
No, exactly, sure, exactly. But it's all. Every single last thing is pathologized. Where you are actually, you're pathologized, right? You are a victim of a disorder. That's why that term disorder is used, because that's the only kind of semantic that can even begin to work.
That's all they fit into.
Right. Yeah. And so then the question of what is, but there's no, even in psychology and psychiatry, there's not a single unified theory as to what even constitutes ordered. Right. So by what metric are you gauging even the concept of a disorder? Yeah. Like what's the range of what constitutes an order? There's 1,000 opinions with no single unified theory, because the whole thing is bunk. Yeah. Right. Yeah. DSM-5, which is basically the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, the fifth version, which is the current one, is functionally just its Bible. And
which does have body dysmorphia in it, by the way.
Yeah. Well, a whole host of
which
things.
is kind of schizophrenic, pardon the pun, but in itself.
Yeah, sure, exactly, yes.
Because with what we're going through with the whole transgender stuff.
No, exactly. That's bleeding.
As a mental illness.
No, that's bleeding. Yeah, it's because the DSM constantly playing catch up. Yeah. That's the whole thing. It's entirely politically, but go ahead.
Can I just pose, if I'm right or wrong, but I believe I've read somewhere that the Holy Spirit is a revelation, a revealer of both Scripture and of the reality of the world around us.
Yeah, the Scriptures
in us.
Yeah,
apart from its transformative.
No, but
that it does to us.
Yeah, that's attributed to the Spirit of God, absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
It is. It's the Spirit is that.
Hence why the Word of God is described as the sword of the Spirit.
Yeah, it reveals that the Word of God is.
Correct. Well, this is back to the point that we were discussing before we. Yeah, correct. This is back to the point that we were discussing before we started the Bible study about being called by God and all those kinds of things, right? Is that apart from divine revelation, again, and you see this play out in there's one such remark. It's not the main point; it's a passing reference he makes. But in Paul's address to the Athenians in Acts 17, he makes reference to the fact that the Greek people, were like, he likened them to someone stumbling through the dark. right, I'm paraphrasing here, but stumbling through the dark, kind of inching their way towards God but not getting there. It's a very apt description because of all the pagan cultures in history, no one came as close to, other than the Greeks, because they're close. Okay. Yeah, the Greeks, and then daylight in second or third. You get, you know, a lot of what Socrates and even Plato says is there are multitudes of those philosophies that are accurate, biblically speaking. Aristotle as well, particularly in regards to his conceptualization of what's called the prime mover or the unmoved mover. This is a massive paraphrase because it's a very long subject on Aristotle, but essentially he uses an apple tree as the example. An apple tree, it starts as a seed, it grows, it sprouts, it comes into fruit, it sprouts apples, the apple then falls, and one or more of those apples, they blow around in the wind, and then they plant in the ground, they get watered, and then that apple, the seed from that apple grows up into an apple tree. So he's using it as the cycle that is apparent in life, right? You see this in the years, the seasons, right? The cycles of the moon, the cycles of the sun, the cycles of the movements of the planets, blah, blah, blah. Everything's a cycle, right? That's why our modern views of life as linear is again a very atheistic concept. But point being is that in Aristotle, he uses the example of an apple tree. So he's going, well, in terms of, he's thinking on a philosophical level, metaphysics, so the reality of nature and being itself. If you keep going back, the apple from the apple tree, the tree to the seed to the apple, you know, that whole process, he uses logic and reason to arrive at the conclusion, the accurate conclusion, that process had to have a beginning, right? The apple had to come into existence at some point. The cycle has to begin. So you have to have the first apple tree, or the first, in this case, the first seed, right? It's kind of a chicken and an egg question, in one sense, right? Which we also know the answer to, by the way, because it's the chicken, because there's proteins in the eggshell that come from inside the dinosaur. Well, yeah, I suppose the whole T-Rex thing, yes.
But the egg wouldn't survive without a chicken sitting on it. So.
No, correct. And there's a whole host of things, exactly. Anyway. But so the point is, he reasons back and so there must have been the beginning. It must have been the first apple tree. He uses this as an extrapolation for all of the cosmos, all of the universe itself, right? There must have been.
We're doing the Big Bang Theory, though. We're doing the same sort of thing.
Well, yeah, and it depends how it's done. But yes, I take your point. Yes, you're correct. And so the whole host of things that he then deduces. He doesn't. So the prime mover, prime meaning the first mover or the unmoved mover, right? You can translate different ways. He doesn't ascribe to it personhood, right? Because he's also coming down the pike from this concept of the logos, which is what then John picks up, right? In the beginning was the word, right? The logos, okay? And the logos for the Greeks was certainly for the Stoics, so certainly for those who were descended ultimately from Plato's philosophy, the logos in Greek culture, especially by the first century when John's using it in the beginning of his gospel, was the uncreated generative force of the universe. So the logos created the universe and it sustained the universe, and that's why John then points to the logos as actually being not just an impersonal force, but actually a person, namely Jesus, right? That he is the logos. So the Greeks were like getting close-ish.
Yeah, they just missed the time.
And that's why because they couldn't get, because it's entirely my point, is that outside of divine revelation, so this literally, and also the work of God in our mind, right, the illuminating of the mind by God, as opposed to the false illuminating or enlightening, vis-a-vis the Enlightenment, vis-a-vis Buddhism or the Eastern philosophies, right? Outside of divine revelation, human reasoning gets you so far, only so far, and you're going to be falling short, right? Because of original sin, because the fact that the image of God is shattered and broken in us, it's not like, oh, all human beings are made in the image of God, yeah, but there's a gigantic asterisk next to that statement, right? So that's why you can't just say, oh, all human beings are made in the image of God.
The corrupted image.
A completely corrupted image, broken and shattered. It's like a mirror that's been shattered into a million pieces. It's also not technically a mirror anymore, right? It's there-ish, but like not really, right? So in our salvation, in our redemption, it's actually the restoration of the image of God in us, right?
Well, Jesus was the perfect image of God in his humanity.
Yes, he is described literally as the image and likeness of God. So he is the image of God, and so then that's that whole connection between us being conformed into the image of the Son. It's actually the restoration of the image of God in us, yeah. But anyway, with regards to the point there about the Greeks, and that's why, again, not even slightly a coincidence that what is the culture in which Christ arrives into was an entirely Greco-Roman culture.
Yeah.
Greek, where Greek is in in the ancient world, in the empire, Greek is to them what English is to us. Right?
But the actual philosophy and that, would that be sort of as in ground into everybody?
Foundational. Foundational.
What would,
Literally
foundational. About Socrates and his...
Literally foundational, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. The Stoics, the Epicureans, then the rise of Neoplatonism in the centuries that would come afterwards. The Neoplatonism, yeah, absolutely.
So for them, it's to actually go from Logos to actually God the Creator wouldn't have been that big a step. It would have been a slight...
No, because the understanding of the Logos gets first defined in Ephesus back in the 6th century essentially, or 7th century nearly actually, but the 6th century in Greece, in Ephesus, which is a Greek city historically.
Because Paul stood up and to the unknown God, well, I'm going to tell you who he is now.
Yeah, correct. That's just him using that as a good oratorical kind of segue. But then and so all those explanations, yes, because the Greeks already held and understood that the Logos was the force that created the world and sustained it. Well, that's exactly what God is, right? So you can see they're getting there, but they're not. They can't. That jump can't happen because they haven't had the divine revelation. They haven't had the scriptures. They haven't been illuminated by God. Blah blah blah. Right. So that's the marquee difference, and that's the problem we're suffering from even at this point now, because we've decoupled knowledge from the source of knowledge, because we've decoupled human reason, so the mechanism, from the source, divine revelation. We're now suffering from the exact. So that's my whole point about psychology and psychiatry. That's my whole point about all these other things. Blah 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 blah. You can't actually reach those conclusions, and that's the issue. So it's eminently logical that Jesus walked on water, because in the scale of being, the chain of being, the scale of accomplishment, walking on water that he created in the first place, is not something that's illogical to believe. In fact, it would be illogical to think that he could create water, but somehow then not walk on it, or do anything that he wants with it.
Yeah, we've got sci-fi movies like The Abyss where they manipulate water perfectly.
No, I suppose, yeah, good point. Yeah.
Advanced
Touche.
science.
Touche, yeah, sure.
And the creator of water, you don't think he can manipulate skin effect?
Yeah, and so this is where the hubris comes in, and I'll jump off on this so we can jump back in.
Sorry.
Is that, no, it's not a problem, this is part of the point. Is that the hubris actually comes in thinking that that story is only as believable as it is related to our ability to do things with water. So ironically, denying or rejecting the concept that Jesus walked on water is done so through the metric of whether I can.
Okay. Right. Yeah.
That's my whole point about experiential knowledge, right? So again, it just circles back to shock horror, the exact same. It's like Scooby-Doo every single time, like when they capture the bad guy and they pull out, see who you really are, and they pull off the hood, or they pull off the mask that the bad guy's wearing, and every single time that happens, it's just human pride, right? So the excuse of, oh, this couldn't happen, and again, all the air of supposed sophistication and qualification and expertise and blah 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 among atheism and other such things which reject this stuff, and then Scooby-Doo, you pull off the mask and you realise it's just arrogance. You pull off the mask, it's just pride. It's just hubris, right? Why couldn't Jesus have done this? Well, because I can't.
Yeah, I'm much better than Jesus.
Right? That's my whole point about experiential knowledge. Right?
Somebody comes with an attitude they're not going to believe this. They see something miraculous and go, well, that didn't happen. We know that didn't happen because it can't happen.
Because it can't happen.
But then they see something that can be explained as by natural things, and they say, well, that doesn't prove anything. That just happens naturally.
Exactly. The excuses go 1,000. Exactly. And so the double standards are replete. That's exactly the whole point. Because ultimately, it's the same thing as, it's the same atheist who argues that if I had enough evidence, then no, there's not enough evidence.
Yeah.
Because there's not enough evidence, because that's a red herring. That's an excuse that you use to delay and to put off and to shut down, because there's no amount of evidence that would be given to you. I can give you one piece or 1,000 pieces. And if I gave you one piece, you'd demand 2. If I gave you 1,000, you'd demand 1,001. If I gave you 10,000, you'd demand 10,001.
Yeah.
It's never enough, because it's actually a lie. You don't actually want the evidence.
Yeah, you're not after proof.
You're not interested in it at all. No.
You just want to reinforce your own opinion.
Thank you. Yes, correct. Exactly.
And so you become argumentative just to prove
Exactly.
your opinion.
And in many respects, that's what's kind of going on to a degree here as well. So let's circle back to it.
Were you going to say something? Yeah, you. I could see you.
Yes.
I could see you.
No, jump in. No, you can. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I've just been reading a few books by this guy called Michael Denton. You may or may not have heard of. He wrote about evolution.
It sounds familiar.
In fact, it was in the library, the first one.
Yep, sounds familiar.
That was 40 years ago, but then I've got another couple that are recent. And one was about the cell,
Yep.
miracle of the cell. And another one was about the water, what water's got. And he just goes on in this loving way about describing what's in the cell and how beautiful and wonderful it is.
Yeah.
And then he says, oh, but, you know, I'm not a Christian, I'm not a creationist.
Yeah.
I'm hoping for some new laws that will make this all get together.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. Exactly. That's nice. That's vis-a-vis the point that I was just suggesting there. That Elizabeth was raising.
of God,
Yeah.
and he just rejects it.
No, exactly. That's the point. That's the point Elizabeth was raising. That's the point I'm making there.
He loves it. He's describing it so beautifully.
Because it is exactly, but all ultimately it's entirely meaningless in the atheistic perspective. It's all meaningless. It has no purpose. And it all happened by accident anyway. And
It's
ta-da.
sad.
Well, that's what happens. Because metaphysically speaking, God is also the source of love and happiness and joy, beauty. Yeah, in the transcendental sense, exactly. So that's why you often hear me using that transcendental axiom of truth, goodness, and beauty, the irreducible transcendentals of the universe. Beauty also is something which is sourced only in the divine nature, in God. And so the eyes can perceive it, but without divine revelation, in other words, rejecting it. By rejecting divine revelation, you actually so you can see the beauty because it's so obvious, and yet have no genuine comprehension or understanding of the source of it. It's just the obvious self-condemnation.
We look at the complexity of the micro and the complexity of the macro in a cosmology, and we just don't understand why it's so beautiful and complex. You know,
No, correct, but that's all of that is because it's entirely built in a framework that has to reject God.
We understand it, but
no, correct. So cosmologists and other such fields of physics can, on the one hand, point to the evident beauty and incredible blah blah blah, which also is a ridiculous argument because outside of an intelligent mind, there is no such thing as beauty. So not realizing the complete self-contradictory language that they're employing, will then at the same time employ even more completely erroneous language of. So you're highlighting the beauty, and again with an asterisk because they deny the very source of beauty. So beautiful, entirely accidental, entirely meaningless, entirely purpose. Well, so it's beautiful but has no meaning. How is it beautiful? But so you go, well, that's logical because that's the whole issue. It's not. That's the irony. That's the whole point I'm making about arrogance and hubris. The arrogance of atheism is thinking that it's the logical answer. That is the arrogance because everything else is screaming.
Yeah, we have things that are
against the atheistic
absolute mysteries we have no explanation for: dark matter, dark energy. And also the fact that electrons...
Which are largely ad hoc creations to be able to try and justify the mass of the universe we can't see.
We don't know what this is.
Yeah, exactly.
We can observe what's...
No, because those are part of the logic. We have. Why is there so much mass? We have no idea.
We don't know why. But then you go down to why are electrons just popping in and out of existence?
Yeah, because they do from our perspective.
They do that.
When you look at them subatomically, they just appear one moment and then they disappear and then they appear somewhere else.
No. And that's the mystery of quantum mechanics, and they don't know why that is.
Well, it's a mystery if the entire confines of existence is to the edge of the universe. I'm saying that paradoxically, but is the universe and nothing else?
Well, they're now seeing past the edge of the universe with the JWT, and they're going, that's not supposed to be there. There's not supposed to be galaxies that far back.
This is the whole human reason detached from divine revelation. Yeah. So verse 12 through to 21 again just finishes off the recounting against things that have all been covered in previous chapters. So verse 12 through 21, I should say. Now certain Ananias, a man who was devout by the standard of the law and well spoken of by the Jews who lived there, came to me and standing near said, Brother Saul, regain your sight. At that very hour I regained my sight and saw him. And he said, the God of our fathers has appointed you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear a voice from his mouth. That, if anything, is one of the million texts that references what you were asking me prior to this lesson, Lisa. The God of our fathers has appointed you to know his will. Paul didn't just magically arrive at this conclusion by himself. And to see the righteous one and to hear his voice, it's all by the appointment of God. So verse 15, for you will be a witness to him, witness for him to all men of what you have seen and heard. Now why do you delay? Rise up and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling upon his name. Again, this is all, you can read about this in the earlier chapters of Genesis, earlier on in the book of Acts, I should say. Now it happened that when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, that I fell into a trance, and I saw him saying to me, hurry and get out of Jerusalem. This is what happens years later. So he goes, after this event in Damascus, he's introduced to the church in Damascus. The Jewish authorities in the city and other authorities then seek to try and capture him. He escapes in the middle of the night over the city walls. He then flees into Arabia, and we're just told that. We're not quite told exactly what he does there, but he flees into Arabia for, I think, about 2 or 3 years off memory. He then returns to Jerusalem, meets up with Peter and James and the other apostles for the first time. He's there for, I can't remember exactly how long. It's back in those early chapters. But then they find out that he's there, and then the Jewish authorities find out that Paul's there, and then they seek to capture him. That's what he's describing here.
Well, nothing would make you angrier than a traitor to your own kind.
That's all of this is. That's the entire scene. This is literally where we are in the book of Acts, in chapters 20 and 21, and now 22. That's all of this history building into this.
To this day, we still treat traitors with the death penalty, to this very day.
Yeah, and there's times where that's justified, and there's times where they may not be a traitor. But that's a whole other complex issue. And so I said,
it's just the anger and the
sure.
It's the worst thing.
Well, all of this is completely unlawful anyway. They're not even close to. They're not even trying to follow the law concerning due process and anything else.
Yeah.
Verse 19, and I said, Lord, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another I used to imprison and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I was standing by approving and guarding the garments of those who were slaying him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you away to the Gentiles. Again, in verse 18 he says, they will not accept the witness about me. They refuse to. They won't do it.
Can I argue the point also? Maybe
Go for it.
Paul is not the traitor.
No, he isn't.
The fact but the fact is that
It's-
all through the Old Testament it points to Jesus' coming.
Yeah.
All these other people that are not seeing that.
No.
It's not like he's going against anything that's not already been talked about all
That's
through
their view of him of being Sanhedrin.
But the irony is what I'm saying is they're the ones that are treacherous. They're the ones that.
Well, this is why judgment.
leading
This is why
their people
yeah.
astray. These are the heads of all of these Pharisees and they're the ones that are treacherous. They're leading their people astray.
Well, that's why all the condemnatory language is used, and that's why Jerusalem is then condemned and judged in AD 70. So that's the basis. What makes this?
I'm not saying that he is. What I'm saying is it's their anger towards him.
I understand.
based on
That's how they would perceive it.
Yeah,
Because
that perceiving
again,
him.
going back to what we were saying before, their own arrogance about not being able to. They're making the narrative fit their situation for various reasons. I can't. They've all come in from different places. They've all got different stations in life. They're making the narrative fit there. So when things change that are really obvious that they can't see for whatever reason.
Even Jesus tried to show them, you know.
Correct. Well, yes.
So it's
didn't. Yeah. So like showing them, but also condemning their blindness at the same time. Like in fact, he explicitly states that the reason why he speaks in parables is to show them they don't get it.
Yeah.
So we can sit here now, right? And you don't have to have an academic background in theology and philosophy, and you can understand the parables. This is entirely my point about the interplay or the relationship between human reason and divine revelation. Without divine revelation, and that's not like going into the bush with your Bible sitting on a tree and just coming up with the answers yourself. That's not what I mean at all. What I mean is the source of divine revelation, this, and the Spirit of God who works through this to bring us understanding. That's what I'm referring to, right? So I'm not just referring to like you coming up with ideas yourself.
No.
Ironically, that's actually you doing the exact same thing of decoupling human reason from divine revelation.
All I'm saying is these guys are going way above they would for anybody else. They want Paul so badly.
Yeah, because there's a particularity to it, because the tomb is still empty, and they know it, and everyone knows it, and everyone in Jerusalem knows the tomb's still empty, and the tomb's sitting right there, and it's empty.
And they had to bribe the soldiers.
And the body is nowhere, because of course it's not, because they're actually telling the truth when the resurrection happened. But this is all because of the apostasy that's occurred. See, they come out of Babylon. It's apostasy that causes them to go into Babylon. Of course, that's a lot of the context of what we're looking at with the Ten Commandments, and some of the things we've been talking about when we're talking about things from Ezekiel or Jeremiah or wherever. It's apostasy that causes them to be judged by going into exile in Babylon in the 6th century. They're then brought back out. There's a period of reformation, if you want to call it that, in one sense. There's a period under Ezra and Nehemiah where there's a flourishing of faithfulness, but then inevitably they've brought a lot of things back from Babylon with them, and that ends up getting inculcated, and it grows and it festers. They don't go back to blatantly worshipping idolatrous statues on the streets.
Like Baal and that.
Yeah, they don't go back to that. They don't go back to human sacrifice, but they adopt new forms of this spirit of kind of like what we talked about when we talked about adultery, and the fact that adultery is often used figuratively to describe spiritual, like apostasy, like spiritual adultery. That's actually the more common usage.
It's just that Paul actually has to run away time and time again to get out of Jerusalem.
Correct.
And the only time when it's set in his heart to go to Jerusalem, they get him big time.
They were getting big time, yeah. And look, all of this is because of the fact that the fact that they're actually engaged in. So they're no longer worshipping blatant idols. They're no longer doing human sacrifice. They're no longer doing a number of those things. So those things get reformed, but their idols have become spiritual and intellectual, not physical and material. And they're arguably worse. And so a lot of those teachings. Sorry?
Sounds like today.
Yeah, well, sure, yeah. Well, many times in heresy, including ours, yes, correct. Is that, and so, it's a both and, because we've also then imported various other religions from around the world, like Buddhism and Islam and Hinduism and Judaism, etc. So it's a both and, but it started off with the intellectual. And that's why, again, then the versions of all the things that the Pharisees and all these errors, the things that these exact Jews here believed, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all the other people who followed them, is what then goes on to become the foundation of Judaism. And that's why the two Talmuds that they have are, in no form of coincidence, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. That's exactly what's going on here.
Which they say that Jesus... I've been reading bits of that. It's really quite disturbing what they...
Well, yes, Jesus is explicit.
A sorcerer, he...
Correct, that was the view that
worshipped
came.
a brick that...
Oh, you've been reading the Jewish...
bits to the
Jerusalem
Babylonian Talmud, and that he's,
Babylonian.
and I don't even know that I can even say it, where he is at the moment.
No, yes, he's in Hades. He's in Gehenna. He's in hell, burning in excrement. Is the belief? Yes. That's why
what they think of our
Judeo-Christian is a contradiction in terms.
I find that.
But in a way, when he was separated from God on the cross, and that's an eternal thing.
Well, yeah, he bore that exactly. Yes, correct. And so, look, the prevailing issue here then is that, and this is kind of well, you're trying to point to the irony of it. Yeah, it is ironic. The other issue too is that with its irony, and this is the whole nature of this is the whole problem with human reasoning decoupled from divine revelation, in that this was exactly, they all knew that this was the time in which the Messiah was meant to come.
That's what I mean. That they know this. This is the bit that
because Daniel said so, and all that has
He's
been.
not going to look like this.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. They want
And there are many.
their narrative.
Great big
they
shining.
Humans trying to control God.
Well, it was a changing of a version of it.
Like in the life of Brian, this has to be the Messiah. I've followed so many already.
Yeah, I followed so many already. A good reference. Yeah. The issue is that they knew exactly what the time period was, because Daniel had foretold it and predicted it, and all the things that would kick off that time period of counting down to the arrival of the Messiah, from the command to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem and or to rebuild Jerusalem itself, etc., in the days of Artaxerxes II, and so on and so forth. All of that had happened, and again, so they knew exactly when, and so that's why there were many. You get vague references to it in the Bible. You get it elsewhere in more explicit references. So Christ, for example, in the Olivet Discourse, when he's pronouncing judgment on Jerusalem, which would come 40 years later from his time, roughly, he says that there will be many false Christs and there will be many who will say, I'm over here, blah, blah, blah. And that's talking about that first century. Because that happened. There were a whole bunch of people who were claiming to be the Messiah.
Because
And not only
expected, you
yeah, not only do we know that, we know that there were other people named Jesus who claimed to be the Messiah, right? So there were many people claiming whose name was, because it was a fairly relatively common name, not the most, but relatively common name, and there were many other Jesuses claiming to be the Messiah, to be the Christ or the Messiah, right? So Jesus wasn't just like kind of speculative. No, like whilst he was alive, there were other people claiming to be the Messiah, right? And the question is that none of them came even faintly or remotely close to the list of things in the Old Testament, that's so clearly and blatantly, apart from the fact that many of them weren't born in Jerusalem, weren't born in Bethlehem, which was already a non-starter.
And he proved his authority by healing the sick and making the lame walk.
And everything else, all those kinds of things, 100%. Many of them weren't even born in Bethlehem, which is a non-starter. But that shows the whole concept of deception. You have people who were following some of those, not huge numbers, but there were people who were following various other guys claiming to be the Messiah, and they weren't born in Bethlehem. But how illiterate do you have to be in the Old Testament? He comes from the town of David, guys. Yeah. He's not born in Bethlehem. It's a non-starter.
Well, even the three wise men knew that where he was going to be born.
Well, part of that is all of the symbology of the kingdom of God expanding to the nations, because these three pagan magicians from...
Yeah, I don't know if it's three. I never say three there.
No, it's going the whole three wise men story kind of thing. No, it's not three at all. And they also don't come at his birth. They come sometime in the first 2 years. But anyway, it's the story. The wise men, however many number they were.
It was because it was just based on the 3 gifts that were talking about.
That's where the we three kings, which I really like. It's just not 100% accurate. It doesn't need to be though, because it's symbolic. But yes, no, it was an unnumbered. The three wise men who also were not kings they're pagan magicians from Babylon. They're not strictly, they could be Babylonian, they could also be Persian though, but they're from Babylon. And they're pagan astrologers, they're pagan magicians. They understand the signs in the stars, and they understand the important symbolic values of it, and they see, and that's a whole other complex, a very fascinating subject, but much more complex, which we don't have time for today. And they then arrive in Jerusalem in his infancy. In Bethlehem in his infancy.
So they knew where to go.
They did, because they followed, and again, what that means, complex subject. But so the group of pagan magicians coming from Babylon know exactly who this person is, and the king of Judea has no idea. Nor does anyone, nor do any of the Jews in his court.
And he decides to kill all the babies just to be safe.
Right. So none of the Jews actually get it, but the pagan magicians from Babylon do. Yeah. That's the whole. So it's a judgment in one sense, but it's also pointing towards exactly what Christ says when he condemns the fig tree as not bearing fruit. Right. The fig tree being one of the symbols of the Israelites, and particularly Jerusalem itself. The kingdom of God will be, Matthew 21, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to a nation bearing fruit. The Jews who believe and continue on, like the apostles, and then all the other nations of earth, right? That's part of this judgment. And so then that's why he then, that's the whole verse 21. Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles, right? To the Greeks, to the Romans, to the Celts, etc., etc. So this last portion here is then what happens basically in response, verses 22 to 29. And they were listening to him up to this statement, the group, right? The Jews, in other words, the mob of Jews. They were listening to him up to this statement, and then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. So this is exactly the same thing that happened in Athens, and I've pointed this out back in chapter 7, and I'll make this point here again. Right? There comes a juncture in the speech where he gets cut off.
Gentiles, right? He said Gentiles, that was it.
Yeah. So in Athens, talking to the Epicurean and the Stoic philosophers, who were the two preeminent schools of Hellenistic or Greek philosophy in the first century, they had similar beliefs. They had other differences of beliefs, but anyway, the Epicureans and the Stoics, they're listening with great intent because Paul's clearly intelligent. He's speaking to them in Greek, right? He's fluent in Greek. He was educated in Tarsus at the school there, So his Greek education, classical education, he knows the classics. He would have read the Iliad, he would have read the Aeneid, etc., etc. He knew Stoic philosophy, he knew Epicurean, he knew all those things. He then gets all the way through, and then eventually he mentions, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says basically, God proved all this, what he'd been saying about Jesus. God proved all this to be true by raising him from the dead. And as soon as he mentions resurrection, they exit stage left, they're out, right? Because to the Epicureans and the Stoics, resurrection was a ludicrous idea, not in the way that atheists think it is now. I'm talking about in terms of desirability. Epicureanism and Stoicism, but especially Epicureanism, a lot of those philosophies go on to form Gnosticism, right? And one of their major beliefs is that the material world is inherently corrupt, inherently evil. So not like it's been corrupted by us. No, it's inherently evil in and of itself, right? This is a completely unbiblical idea. It denies the goodness and the beauty of creation. It denies that God made it very good, right? All these things, right? Same thing with the land of Canaan, like we pointed out in sermons of recent, right? Is that the land of Canaan is described in Abraham's day as being a land of milk and honey, which was an ancient Near Eastern figure of speech, right? Because those two things were luxuries. To us, they seem common, right? But it would be like describing them as, fine jewels and Ferraris or something. I don't know. But the land of milk and honey. So the land is called beautiful and good, but it's been corrupted by the horrifically barbaric and evil pagan Canaanite culture. Right, so the human beings are the ones who have marred and scarred the land in that kind of way. So then God bring the Israelites in, bring judgment upon the Canaanites for their evil, driving them and wiping them out from the land, then redeems the land, because now the light of God, all those kinds of things, right? So same kind of concept. Now, resurrection for them was ludicrous because the whole point in broader Platonic philosophy was to escape this material world, to reach the realm of ideals, right? The higher spiritual realm. I won't bore you what that means. It's a very complex.
It's like a bit like that too, trying to escape the.
Yeah, in some respects, there's some differences, but in certain respects, to become. Buddhism's largely about becoming one with the universe, nirvana.
Escaping reincarnation and
escaping the karmic cycle, yes, and becoming, and what that means is coming again. They're pantheistic about the universe, but anyway, it's a similar kind of concept to a degree.
Yeah.
So the concept of being raised into a body, coming back into this material world, into the flesh, was the very opposite of what that's. That's why they laugh and they leave, because that's just. But that's why Paul left it right to the end. So I want you to notice here, and this is how condemnatory this is of their actions. They're listening with great intent, right? He's speaking Hebrew. They're hushed. They're listening, right? Right up until he mentions being sent to the Gentiles, to the non-Jews. That's their linchpin. That's their checkout point, right? So the absolute hatred and contempt that they had for anyone who was not Jewish is there is no limit to.
It's their pride in that they thought they were the chosen.
We are the chosen
by
ones.
God.
We're the chosen ones.
And no one else.
No, we're the chosen ones, and this is the folly. And because part of one of the central, it's not the only one, there's many, but one of the central errors of not only their belief at this time, but even historically, especially in the lead up to the Babylonian exile, is we are safe and secure in the covenant simply because of our blood. Right? Simply because we're Israelites, that's what keeps us in. We're worshipping Baal. We're worshipping Asherah. We're worshipping Molech. We're literally sacrificing our kids to Molech, burning them to death. But we're still all good with God because we're Israelites.
God's monarchy.
Yeah, we're still good, and we're still the chosen people because I'm a descendant of Abraham, physically, of the flesh. That's the problem. And God condemns that left, right, and centre, and actually makes the point that no, it's always, without faith, it's nothing. And not only without that, without faith, you're actually condemned by me and disconnected from me, and you've severed yourself from me. So this is the whole point here: is there's only one Jew in this particular crowd who actually is with God, and it's none of the Sanhedrin. It's Paul. He's as much a Jew as anyone else standing here, and only one of them are actually on God's side.
It's the Jews' Jew.
Yeah, and only one of them, exactly, rabbi, everything else, most talented rabbi. He's the only people who come even close to intellectually matching him in terms of qualifications and acumen are the high priest and others. That's it. Outside of that, Paul's the most educated and talented teacher of the law
and
here.
yet he's squandering all that, credibility
By going to those
to the Gentiles.
to those beastly goyim. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want you to see how condemnatory that is. This is the whole point I made. I made this point last week, and the week before that, I think, actually, about the whole incident in the temple with the four Christians who had taken the Nazarite vow, blah blah blah, and more importantly about the reference. I'll come back to it. Their completely unfounded accusation about Trophimus. If I can find the verse for it. Yeah, chapter 21, verse 29. For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city, right? And their whole accusation was he had even brought Greeks into the temple and had defiled this holy place. So they had no evidence that that had happened. They'd only seen Trophimus in the city of Jerusalem, and they'd accused him of being in the temple, which point number one didn't happen. But point number two, it wouldn't matter anyway,
It's irrelevant.
because the court of the Gentiles is just that, right? So they're entire, because that's the whole thing though. But that's what they've been doing. They're not even allowing Gentiles. They're not even allowing non-Jews, like Greeks, Romans, whoever it happens to be, into the court of the Gentiles. Instead, they're setting up money stalls and they're fleecing people and robbing them, like they were in Jesus' day, and that's why Jesus starts flipping tables and beating guys up with a whip, right? Absolute corruption, and this is the whole point. Is again, that's why their vision of what constituted the Messiah and the Messianic kingdom was the right timing, but the completely wrong understanding of its nature. They understood that exactly that the kingdom was coming at that time, and it did. That's why the whole issue in eschatology is the belief of the kingdom of God being in the future is not biblically accurate in the Old Testament or the New. It's about its nature. And the issue for them was the nature of their kingdom was a great mortal hero who would rise up, help us to overthrow the shackles of the Romans, which is ironic because you've been in a completely meshed incestuous matrimony with the Romans for like 100 years by this point. But anyway, you invited the whole reason why the Seleucid Empire fell in this region was because the Jews invited the Romans under Pompey to come in.
They invited them, did they?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
The Romans didn't just waltz in and say.
I thought they did. Okay.
No, not really.
And now they're going, we don't like the Romans anymore.
The Judeans invited the Romans in to fight off the Seleucids, and the Romans won.
Yeah.
The Romans then install, and the Romans as a result install what goes on to become the Herodian dynasty. That's how that begins, functionally speaking.
Okay.
Yeah. It's about a 15 to 20 year process. Pompey, that begins there in the Jewish revolt there begins in 63 BC, and eventually the Herodian dynasty is established, I think, in 40 BC. Yeah.
Okay.
Right, it's a process, but it's a 15 to 20 year operation. But yeah, eventually that's how it happens.
I thought it was always conquest.
Oh no! It's not like Egypt. Egypt, they just roll in, and there's political machinations. You know, you're talking Julius Caesar, Mark Antony and Cleopatra, that whole ordeal. But that was just pretty much that's just the Roman conquest of Ptolemaic Egypt. This was the Jews inviting the Romans to help them overthrow the Seleucids. The Greeks. Yeah. They've been joined. That's why that whole marital and spiritual adultery language gets used.
Okay.
That's the whole thing in Revelation that then starts playing out this concept of the whore of Babylon and blah blah. So the fact that and again, all of this shows you how much they've just tossed the Old Testament into the bin, and all the rabbinical teachings and machinations of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the rabbis and scribes more broadly over the course of the last couple of centuries. That is now the focus for them, right? All those things. You're talking about our father Abraham, the very same Abraham to whom was said that through you all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, that you'll be the father of many nations. Many as in like more than one.
Yeah, and they
Got that bit.
and which they would now consider those people Gentiles.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so, no, Abraham's our father. Yeah, but the Abraham who would be the father of many nations. No, he's our father. You see what I'm saying? So they've actually, see what I'm saying? They've actually abandoned. This is my whole point about, this is why the whole view, this is why I've said before, and say it again, and I'll keep saying it for the rest of my life. Judeo-Christian is a contradiction in terms. It is as contradictory as saying Islamo-Christian or Hindu-Christian or atheist. It's as ridiculous as a term. And it's not born out of hatred. It's not one single cell of my being that hates them in that sense, for their ethnicity, let alone for whatever. The point is just about what's true, right? Judaism is not on the same team as Christianity. Okay, Judaism is formulated nearly 150 years after this point. It's the inculcation of all these kinds of erroneous beliefs that survive through the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which get destroyed in AD 70. Their teachings kind of fluster on from there, and that's what ends up forming the Talmud and the Mishnah and everything else that's in between, right? That's why you can find things that are said in the Talmud, and you can just find almost that exact quotation of an idea in the Gospels, because that's what it is. It's the foundation of those things. And the despising and hatred that is possessed for the Goy, for the non-Jew, is something that is still there even to this day. Right? Any devout Jewish man will pray over morning, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has not made me a Goy." In other words, who has not made me a non-Jew.
And this is the motivation in the West Bank for them just taking other people's land and settle.
It's part of it, and again, I've explained the complexities of that whole affair, is that it's possible to have bad guys on both sides of a war, despite what Hollywood films would like to tell us. Is that, no, that land's theirs because we are the chosen ones. That's the prevailing belief. Except you've not, because you've rejected the Messiah. And all those who are on the side of the Messiah, be they Jew, be they Greek, be they Roman, be they Celt, be they Chinaman, be they Indian, be they anything else, right?
I used to go,
is part of the chosen. Yeah, go ahead.
when I was in London, I probably told you this. I was working for an Orthodox Jewish family. And I'd go around, have lunch, dinner with them. And they were very hospitable people. Like, you get tons of food, which was great. But I would always be separate. I'd always have my own separate little cloth thing that I would sit. They'd all sit on the other tablecloth, but I had my little bit like that, and I was only allowed to eat them. I was. But I did love Ormy. She was lovely. But there were people there that hated me. I could feel it. They hated me. Yeah. Oh yeah, they hated. Not all of them, but there was. She had 3 sons. One of them hated. I think he hated for the sake of hating. He was full of hate. I could smell him. I could smell him from the other side of the room. This rot. I know that sounds melodramatic, but it was probably bad breath. I don't know, but I could smell him from the other, and he was full of hate, just hate. And they weren't all like that. There was another lovely woman who was a wife, and she was more than happy to teach me, but that was frowned upon by some other wife. Yeah, that would have been frowned upon. That was not done. Yep. You know, it was very interesting. And I remember once when I was staying there's some. And it was when Yasser Arafat was still alive. There was some bombing or something that happened, and it happened on the Sabbath, and some other Jewish holiday. And she said, this woman Ruth, she said, I see they do it on our. They make sure they do it on a day where we can't retaliate, and she was really angry. And I said, why are they doing it? Because I was in my 20s. Yeah, why are they doing that? And all she said to me was, read your Bible, read your Old Testament. And I thought, okay. But I think I don't think that would have answered, the hate.
I think she's focused on that. You will live in a land of trouble if you don't follow.
Yeah. But Ormy wasn't like that. She wasn't like that.
Well, no, that's the same perennial attitude. Why is this happening? Because we're the people of God. That's the bit. Well. But you're not though. But you're not, because you've rejected God. You've rejected the Messiah, and it's not my opinion. It's not. It's Jesus' opinion. So God's own opinion is that you've rejected Him, and so why on earth would I arrive at a different conclusion than the one that God's arrived at, right? But then again, this whole conversation would get classed as anti-Semitism.
You trouble will follow you. So
Yeah, correct. That's that observation has
Incredibly
that
interesting,
observation
though. It's a great job.
unfortunately has not been made because you've had 109 different expulsions from different cities or kingdoms over the last 2,000 years and counting.
How many?
About 109
109, yeah.
from people who are enemy from all kinds of different cultures and people, but everyone else other than them is the problem. It's always someone else's fault. That's another issue altogether. But this is the kind of attitude that I'm not pointing that just to have I'm not ranting. I'm pointing that to because this is the context of what we're looking at here. The fact that they're jumping off. See, the jumping off point for the Stoics and the Epicureans was philosophical. Right? It was about the resurrection. You see what I mean? It had nothing to do with people this and people that. Because he actually addresses that like a little bit earlier on in his speech in Athens. In his discourse there, he actually mentions about how God has established the boundaries of nations and blah, 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 and given things to different peoples and so he's talked about peoples and nations, right, blah, blah. But their jumping off point is entirely philosophical. Like it's about a point of philosophy, namely the concept of resurrection and metaphysics and stuff. Their jumping off point here still has elements of intellectual, but their pointing off here is just basically racial, essentially. Basically, it's just the blinding hatred for anyone who's not a Jew. Not them, yeah. And so that even goes for him, and so that's why he again. Basically, this is an instance of him being considered a race traitor. Right? It's like what happens in there's multiple contexts. You see this even today. You see it prominently, unfortunately, in African American communities in the US, who typically vote Democrat, for example, particularly in urban areas in the United States. And even in those contexts, if someone then, this is just a tried example, but if someone then votes Republican or votes Independent or something that's not Democrat, the racial abuse that they then receive as a result of that is just wild. Like terms, completely horrifically derogatory terms like Uncle Tom, which is going back to this character from
that's heavy.
Yeah, porch N-word, which is a reference back to the antebellum South, where you'd have African Americans or Africans who'd be working in the field, but then there'd be those who'd be working in the household, and particularly the main one who essentially was functionally basically a butler, who had often a very good relationship with the family and whatnot. And so then, as a derogatory reference from those who were working in the fields to the one who was on the porch, a porch N.
Well, the Unchained Durango, Samuel Jackson played that part so well.
In Django the movie, yeah, sure, yeah, exactly, yeah. And so calling someone that is like internally within Africa, that's a grotesque reference, yeah. And so all because you didn't vote for the particular party that other people were voting for, like it's grotesque, but this is what happens though.
And yet Trump, I don't want to go there now.
No, it's a whole different.
I was going to say how Trump stands up and talks about how the black vote was supporting him, going, nah, you're in the wrong sort of...
Well, probably not, yeah, but yes, good point. But yeah, so like this kind of internal hate. So now Paul is considered basically a traitor to the Jewish people because he's gone and communed and talked with and lived with Gentiles. with Greeks and with Romans and with Celts.
Now he's a double traitor. He's a traitor to his own Sanhedrin, and now he's a traitor to the Jews.
To the race, yeah, correct. Yeah, exactly. And so they call for him to be put to death. Verse 23, and as they were crying out and throwing off their garments and tossing dust into the air, but they're irate, in other words, they're...
But we wouldn't do that today. What would that be the equivalent? Setting cars on fire?
That would be burning cars in the street and tossing Molotov cocktails, probably, yeah. Smashing in storefronts, yeah. So the commander, the tribune, ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by flogging so that he might find out the reason why they were... Because keep in mind, he's speaking in Hebrew. They don't understand Hebrew.
No, he wouldn't understand.
So he has no idea. So he's been speaking in Hebrew and everyone's been quiet. So as far as the Roman commanders, they're watching this and he's speaking in Hebrew and they all go quiet and they're listening. And then he says... And then it's just going along. And then he reaches the end of a sentence, namely, go, for I will send you out among the Gentiles. And then all of a sudden, the mob erupts into and goes bananas, right? So they can't tell. They don't understand the language. They can't tell. They know that something that he just said has just flipped off the entire mob and has just sent them into a frenzy, but they don't know what it is, so they need to try and figure out what he just said. Right? That's the context
How
here.
could you be interrogated by flogging? You'd be too busy screaming.
Well, no, that's a carrot and stick type of reference. Like they're gonna demand that he tell them under the threat of physical.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so they're going to flog him if he doesn't give them answers. That's the whole. So the commander orders him to be brought into the barracks, into the Antoninian fortress, stating that he should be examined by flogging so that he might find out the reason why they were shouting Bob. But when they were stretching him out with leather straps, this is against basically the same setup that Christ went through when he was being whipped and flogged by the Romans. When they stretched him out with leather straps, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is Roman uncondemned?" And he would have said this in Greek.
Yeah.
And so but this is the genius, like,
It's probably the only time you'll see a centurion go pale.
probably, yeah.
Does it bring to death sentence or decimation? Wouldn't bring decimation, but flogged a Roman
Look,
citizen.
decimation is large. Look, decimation, so from Decky, decimation is where you would usually, it was largely to deal with mutiny within the ranks.
Okay.
Decimation was where you would take an entire cohort and then kill off 10% of them. Hence,
Yeah,
deci.
I know what that is.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I'm just wondering because
But that was the
there
large-
would have been a punishment for a centurion.
Well, this would have if he had beat up Paul here, you're getting your head taken off.
Oh, really? It is decapitation.
Oh, death penalty, yeah,
Okay,
for sure.
Okay.
Beating up or imprisoning a Roman like this, who's not only Roman but also hasn't been condemned in a Roman court, because no Roman courts is in Jerusalem. Death penalty. Yeah.
Yeah, because
Now he panics. That's why reading novels and reading stories is a good practice for learning how to read anything else, including this kind of narrative, because you have to kind of understand. It's like you have to understand the emotion and the scenery going into it, right? We watch movies and we're not.
The punishment was brutal and swift.
Yeah, well, because it was effective. Yeah, but also note the genius here. So notice as they're holding him and trying to put him in leather straps. Notice that like he's not freaking out and going, "No, wait, hold on, I'm a Roman. No, please don't."
No, he's just calm.
He lets them put him in the straps, or as they're putting him in the straps, and he just turns to the centurion and says, almost in this quasi-inquisitive, not really, so it's like quasi-inquisitive. It's like, "Hey, by the way, do you happen to know or not if it's lawful for you to beat a Roman citizen?" Like so casually. That's what's going on here. Like it's just.
Need know.
That's what I said to you before we got in. That's what I said to you when we were in chapter 21. And I said to you over the next coming chapters, you're going to see a masterclass in basically intellectual combat almost, like just genius levels here. So like he allows them to put him in straps. So they're getting set up to start interrogating him, which is what this is an interrogation. And he waits until they're up to the point where they're basically almost ready to start interrogating him, and then he tells them that he's a Roman citizen, right? So he doesn't let them fall into, and this shows you, by the way, the grace of God, because the Romans come out. This is the whole point about the dichotomy. I meant in this last chapter, I said when we're in 21, I said in chapter 22, you're going to see the Romans being lawful, and then the next chapter you're about to see the Jews absolutely toss the law out the window. And that's part of the irony and condemnation. The pagan Romans acted morally because they don't know he's a Roman citizen. So everything they're doing here is entirely lawful and legal because they don't know he's a Roman. They should have, because he mentioned it back in 21. But massive crowd, people shouting and screaming. So it was understandable that the tribune didn't hear him, right? I explained that in the last chapter. So they don't know he's a Roman, especially because he was speaking Hebrew. They don't know he's a Roman. That's why they were even surprised that he spoke Greek. Remember that in the last chapter, right? The end of the last chapter, right? And he's speaking to them. That's all he's really said. He said hardly anything to the Romans. He's like Jesus. Silent. Said some things to Pilate, and that's another example. That's an extremely sophisticated. People often miss how sophisticated that conversation is between him and Pilate.
It's not quantity, it's quality, isn't it?
No, yeah,
These
people
guys.
People don't realise how sophisticated that conversation is. I'd love to preach it one time, but do a sermon on it, because people they don't understand the complexities, because they don't understand the Old Testament context, or they don't understand Roman culture. That's the problem. And
Put it
so,
on your list.
yeah, it's an extremely,
Long list.
yeah, it's like they're basically engaged in an intellectual chess match with each other. But anyway,
Oh, that sounds good.
so
Especially when he had Pilate saying at the end, well, what is truth?
no, what is truth is an extreme. What is truth is actually people don't realise how sophisticated a comment that is from him, because that goes back to there's a whole host of things philosophically in Roman history.
Oh, you're going to have to do it
Yeah.
now. Now I'm really...
It's,
Yeah.
it's one of the deepest conversations.
No, what is truth goes back to things in Roman philosophy. It goes back to other figures.
Okay, after Easter.
And the fact
Yeah.
that, of course,
Book it in.
Pilate to publicly come out and wash his hands.
Yeah, correct.
Nothing to do with
And
it.
even Jesus' response is very. It has a double meaning in it, which they're speaking. They would have been speaking Greek, but it has kind of a double entendre meaning in Latin, which they weren't speaking. So his response, if you translate it into Latin, is an extremely fascinating response. But anyway.
No,
It's cool
not
stuff,
just
but-
anyway, because
Sure, but point is, anyway,
do
let me
that
get
to
back.
me.
I know, but anyway, so this kind of intellectual,
It's a teaser.
so this chess match, Paul's just playing an entire. Paul's being extremely tactical in what he does and doesn't say and when he says it, and so he waits for them to get him in straps and then turns to him casually, and the whole casuality of it is part of the chess match as well. He's not screaming. He's not going, no, but hold on, wait, no, I'm a Roman. No, he turns to him and says, hey, it's basically like, oh, by the way, do you know if it's lawful? Because of course the Roman centurion knows, and of course Paul knows. So Paul's asking a question he already knows the answer to, and he's also asking a question that he knows the centurion knows the answer to, but he's asking it as a question. It's not a question at all. He's telling him he's a Roman citizen while asking a question in this completely genius move. So is it lawful for you to flog a man who's a Roman and uncondemned? He knows the answer, and he knows that the centurion knows the answer. And he also, notice he says it's the centurion, not the tribune. So he asks one of the underlings.
Yeah.
So, don't get me wrong, centurion, 10 years in the military, he's no slump. He's not a infantryman.
Yeah.
He's an officer. But he doesn't ask the tribune, who's higher ranking than the centurion. He asks one of his subordinates.
Well, it's
So then the
extra
subordinate's got to then turn to his superior.
It's an extra
and
effect, yeah. His own man is saying, good grief, do you know what you're doing, man? Sorry, I was just...
yeah, it's like
That was Bones from Star Trek.
has anyone seen the movie 1917?
Yeah, yes, I might have.
A couple of years ago?
Yes. What's the thing about it? Is that the guy?
It's where you got
a
the
lot
two-
of walking through fields.
Yes, yeah, that's a good guess. Anyway,
That's exactly
Anyway, it's a fascinating movie based on World War One. Very worthwhile watching. But 1917 came out in cinemas a couple of years ago. Anyway, point is that what happens is that basically these two corporals.
Is that the guy running down the trench trying to stop the actual...
That's where that scene's from. Yeah.
Yeah, so he's trying to stop the whole, everybody doing the charge.
They're about to launch a battle.
trap.
Yeah. But the problem is that the Germans have been setting a trap and they know it's coming, and so
They
these
have
two
like-
runners are having to track this message. Anyway, the point I'm trying to draw from that movie is that what happens in that movie is that when is that one of the officers along the way who's been helping them says that when you get to Major such and such, make sure there are witnesses when you give him the letter, because this guy has been in the trenches with his guys. He wants to get into the battle. But headquarters has told him they've received intelligence that the Germans have been basically setting up the British for months, and they know that the attack's coming and it's an ambush. Okay, but he's so gun ho ready to get into the battle for good reason, right? Because they're this close to driving them back and winning that territory that if you told him in isolation, he might just ignore the letter that his officers have given, that his superiors have given him, and say, "Oh, I didn't get the letter."
Impact.
Yeah, so having witnesses there,
There's no backing out.
there's no backing out.
Yeah.
So if Paul just said this to the tribune, the highest ranking guy in the room, well, there's no other. He might have just decided to ignore Paul. Maybe I'm not saying he would have. I'm saying hypothetically. So that's the cleverness in telling the centurion, because then the centurion, he can't make the decision to release Paul. He has to turn to his superior officer and tell him, he's just told me he's a Roman centurion, he's a Roman citizen.
Yeah, this man is a Roman.
What are we going to do?
Yeah.
So then it forces the hand of the tribune to release him. See my whole point about the intellectual chess match? This is so genius. He doesn't tell the highest ranking man in the room, because he's not accountable to anyone else because he's the highest ranking man, which is fair enough. He could just ignore him and no one else would be under the wiser. But because he doesn't have to go and say, all right, man, he can just ignore. He doesn't have to tell the centurions anything. The centurion can't just release Paul. He doesn't have that authority. He has to tell his superior officer, and so then it has to be public in the
But
room.
he comes back and asks Paul. He actually says,
I know, because they're concerned about actually following the law. That's what's so ironic about this. The pagan Romans here.
Yep.
Yeah, and so that's the response that happens is that when this, in verse 26 and following, when the centurion heard this, he went to the commander, the tribune, and reported to him saying, "What are you about to like?" Again, so when you read this, and I'm saying about reading a narrative and filling in some of the scenery and the blanks, like, what are you about to do? For this man is a Roman. Like, you have to understand, this is a guy panicking. He's like, what are you about to do? Like, it's like no, he's a Roman. Like, that's the whole
centurion panicking. They don't panic.
No, they don't panic at all. No. It's like, what are you about to do? Is like question mark, exclamation, question mark. It's like it's like telling you, like, no, stop. Like, that's the whole.
Yeah.
And the tribune, the commander, came to him and said to him, in other words, Paul, tell me, are you a Roman? So that's him turning and realizing, like, eyes go wide, deer in headlights, and like, are you a Roman? Like, that's what's going on here. You have to kind of read between the lines, right? And he says,
It's
yes.
a bit of an oh crap situation, isn't it? Like, oh no.
Coyote in front of the train.
Yeah, well, yeah, and so it's him coming. It's them absolutely. It's the centurion having to, but all because he asked the centurion. That's the stroke of genius. Is he asks the centurion because he knows that the centurion can't just ignore him, because he has to report. He can't just ignore him. Well, actually, let me say it this way: he can't just release him, because then his superior officer is going to go, "Hold on, I didn't give you that order. What are you doing?" He also can't ignore him, because if he ignores him and they start beating him up, and then Paul tells them again, tells the tribune, and he says, well, I told your centurion beforehand.
It's head off.
Homeboy's done, yeah. Right? So the genius is the centurion has to tell his superior officer. He has to tell him before it starts. And so it's forcing that to work out that way, and that just comes through the genius of timing it and saying it that way. It's so clever.
While there's this madness outside, yelling and the screaming and the...
And there's guards trying to who knows what they might be trying to break in, who knows, all this kind of going on.
I think even if you're an uncontrolled crowd, you wouldn't rush a Roman legion.
No, exactly. Well, they might, and they did, because they went to war. They go to war with the Romans in about a decade's time after this, and it doesn't work out well for them.
But the legions are set up so they interlock with each other, and they just mow people down. Yeah,
exactly, and they, especially in open fields and other such open contexts. And so then he just replies with a one-word answer: no.
Paul's speaking Greek at this time.
Yes.
So he's speaking Hebrews.
Speaking Hebrew to the Hebrews, to the Israelites,
And how common is it for people that are not Romans to speak Greek?
Not Romans, those who are not Roman citizens to speak Greek, in this part of the world, rare.
Everywhere in the rest of the world, they all be.
Everywhere else,
So
absolutely.
That's an identification.
That's why they were shocked with him speaking Greek in the last chapter. That's why when he made a comment in Greek, and he turned surprised and said, "You know Greek?
It's low catching.
You speak Greek, yeah. That's okay. You speak Greek, and that's why. And so he was surprised, not because it was like unheard of. It just wasn't. It wasn't universal. It wasn't common, right? So I said this. So in Judea, your average run-of-the-mill Jew speaks Aramaic on the daily. Some of them, a minority of them, would speak Greek. So, for example, obviously all the gospel authors know Greek. So Matthew knowing Greek is not surprising, because he was a tax collector, and he's working right alongside the Romans in collecting tax, so he would know Greek, so he could talk to the Romans, right? So Matthew knows, obviously, Luke knows Greek, right? Blah, 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 blah.
Also, he had Roman bodyguards as well as a tax collector.
That's my point there, yeah, because he's working for the Romans as a tax collector. That's how that works.
So he'd be speaking then to them.
So Greek is still, yes, exactly. So Greek, when conversing with the Romans or with other foreigners, is how that. So if you worked in a commercial, if you're a merchant or you're a sailor or other such things like that, if you're engaging in trade or business with people from around, beyond just Jerusalem or Judea, you would know Greek. But the majority, if you're just from Joe Schmo town, there's no context in which you're speaking Greek, really, because you're not interacting with the Romans. The Romans are just there, and they're policing and making sure things are in order and whatever. But you're not having conversations with Roman legionnaires all the time. It's not happening. So they're speaking Aramaic. That's the lingua franca for them. That's the common language for them. A minority would be bilingual, Aramaic and Greek. Like I said, merchants or tax collectors and such figures. And then some of them would be bi or trilingual if they're part of the Sanhedrin, they know Hebrew. So like Paul knows, he knows Greek, he knows Aramaic, he knows Hebrew. Probably don't know what he does or doesn't know in regards to Latin. But again, Latin was really only mainly spoken in the western provinces of the empire anyway, not the Greek eastern provinces, especially Rome. So yes, he just responds yes. Verse 28, and the commander answered, "I acquired this citizenship with a large sum of money." Right. So citizenship. There's different forms of citizenship in the empire. There were those who would acquire it. Those who were not Roman citizens sui generis, right, by blood or by birth, who could then acquire it through, well, becoming part of the Roman army. So this means that this remark on the part of this tribune is that he's either not from a patrician family or he's actually not Roman or Latin at all. So he's actually from somewhere else in the empire that's been conquered by the Romans, and he's then worked his way up the rung in the Roman army all the way to the position of tribune, which is very impressive. But he's actually not a Roman or even a Latin more broadly.
But the burn that Paul says then, I think he's linking back to the original statement he said to the tribune, whereas I am a citizen of Tarsus, and he's saying I was born a citizen because Tarsus is a Roman.
Because Rome, yes, exactly. Tarsus was an imperial city, and Tarsus was a Roman city. And he has, now we don't know how his family came to have birthright citizenship, but he has birthright. So Paul is a full, as far as all this description, he is.
He's more Roman than the tribune.
Yeah, he is civis Romani. He is a Roman citizen, civis Romani.
But he was actually making the penny drop in the tribune. I've already told you this.
Well, yeah, correct. Yeah, that is part of it too. Yeah, but that didn't quite either didn't hear him properly, or in the midst of everything else, it's whatever.
This is the masterclass where he actually just brings the the claim into land on, and I've already told you this. I was actually born a citizen. You should have tweaked onto this when I told you. It's
partly that. It's also actually partly him saying I acquired this. So when he's saying I acquired this citizenship through a great sum of money, he's saying. It can be that. It's actually something else, but probably ultimately. So it's not that it's
bragging.
Not necessarily.
No,
it's a sort of. It's not that it doesn't contain these elements. It's just there's one really obvious by the way that Paul responds. His response, the actual the core meaning of what this guy's saying is, basically I'll fill in the blank here, just in the inference. I acquired. This is one thing he does say. I acquired this citizenship through a great sum of money. And I'm a Roman tribune. How on earth are you a citizen? How on earth did you become a citizen? He's shocked. I don't understand how this guy's, because he's just a Jew from Jerusalem as far as he knows. That's all he knows, right? They've already deduced that he's not the Egyptian Sicario who they'd been looking for like 4 years, who was obviously had an arrest warrant out for him. They already deduced that in the last chapter, the end of the last chapter, right? So you mustn't be the Egyptian we've been looking for who caused the great revolt in Egypt, right? They know that, but so now they still don't know who he properly is, because they also haven't. He has explained it but he's done it in Hebrew, so they don't know it. That's why keep in mind that's why they brought him back into the fortress, right, to try and figure out what's going on. They still don't know who he is. They just know that he's a Jew. They know nothing about Tarsus. They know nothing about. They know nothing about his Gamaliel and all the stuff he just said to us in this chapter. They don't know. They don't know the Hebrew. They have no idea what he's just said to the Jews, right?
Oh, yeah.
So he's just some Jew as far as they know or understand, right? All this is very reminiscent, by the way, of what happened with Jesus. But
yeah, because I'm just thinking, what I was just thinking, then he wouldn't have been dressed up in all his glad rags. Paulie would have been not.
No, he's just wearing street clothes. Yeah.
Yeah, you wouldn't have, to look at him.
No, nothing even.
If he was caught in the temple, he must have been wearing something.
Oh, sure, but it's not like he's wearing priest's garments. In other words, what I'm saying to you, in terms of them visually identifying him immediately, they knew what the priests looked like. They knew what the high priest looked like. Blah 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 blah, because of those visual accoutrements. they wouldn't have known.
He wouldn't have been in rags, though, is all I'm saying. He would have
Oh no, I
been
don't mean
in-
that. I just mean when I say street clothes, I just mean he's not wearing some obvious identifying. And so they don't know who he is, and so that's why then when he's saying that he's a citizen, and he's like shocked. It's like, I'm a Roman. I'm a tribune. I'm a tribune in the army, a junior one probably here. No, he's probably not the Primus Pilus, but he would be the junior tribune around the age of 20, on his way. You know, eventually the aim would be him becoming part of the Roman Senate.
Hasn't been a good day for him.
No, he's shocked that this random Jew who's causing all this uproar is somehow a Roman citizen. And he's saying, well, I acquired mine through payment of sum, right? I acquired mine through material means, right? Working my way up through the ranks of the army, I paid for it, blah, 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 which was not cheap at all. How on earth are you a citizen? And he then just retorts, I'm a citizen by birth. I'm a civis Romani. I am a birth citizen. I'm as far as birth concerned, I'm as Roman as anyone in Rome. In Rome. How they acquired, so he would have got that from his parents. Did his parents get that from their parents? How this came to be in his family, we're never told. But either way, he is a full-blown civis Romani, a Roman citizen.
So why did he say that to the tribune? What would be his reasoning?
For telling him that he's, or for that wording it that way.
Yeah.
So it's partly there's an immediate kind of tactical reason for doing it, I suppose, or a strategic reason for doing it, and then there's a broader strategic reason for it. The immediate strategic reason is so that he doesn't get beat to a pulp by the Romans.
Oh, well, the lashes.
That's the immediate kind of tactical reason, I suppose. The broader strategic reason is he's then going to turn around, again, this is the next chapter, so partly we'll get to that when we get to it, but he's then going to actually make an appeal to the emperor.
And he's just saying, I have the right to do this because I'm a born...
He's exercising his legal rights here.
Yeah.
Right. So being a Roman citizen comes with a host of things. There's differences, so there's two kinds of Roman citizens.
But he's preparing the ground for what he knows he's probably going to need to do.
Yeah. He wouldn't have had... Well... As a birthright citizen, as a born citizen, he would have had basic, a number of rights, jus commerci, the right of property or the right of ownership of wealth, and other such rights like that.
Had the right of Senate?
No, he would not have had the right of Senate. Okay. No. That's highly unlikely. No, absolutely not. He wasn't a Roman. He wasn't a Latin.
Okay.
He would have had. I can see him having. I can see him having jus suffragi, the right of suffrage. In other words, the right to vote. I can see him having. Okay. I can see him having that. We're never told that.
He certainly has the right for legal justice because he's been taken off later on.
Well, that's all those other various things. Yes, jus commerci, jus connubii, the right of marriage, etc. Okay. That all would have been there. But those were inherent rights for any. That's the bare minimum for a Roman citizen. But the other ones, so he wouldn't have had jus honorum, which was the right of honor. In other words, the right to then enter into public office or the Senate and stuff like that. That was almost exclusively reserved for Romans, ethnic Romans, Latins, and select other examples, like perhaps this tribune.
Because there was some foreign generals that managed to get into the Senate.
Oh no, for sure, yeah. That I was saying too. They are rare examples, and I think this tribune's one of them. So this tribune is talking about he has the full gamut. He clearly has jus honorum because he's a tribune. Yeah. So whether Paul has it or not, I doubt he has that because he's ethnically Jewish, but either way, though, his birthright, his citizenship's actually birthright. So it's ironic. He probably doesn't have the full gamut of legal rights and privileges, compared to the tribune. But the irony is that his citizenship is actually from birth. So there's actually this qualitative element that's different than the tribune. It's wild, yeah. He's shocked by it. The tribune. He doesn't. He's perplexed by it. So part of it is immediate tactical kind of reasoning, I suppose, to not get beaten to a pulp. The other is broader strategic. He's showing them, I'm not your enemy.
And I'm not insignificant.
I'm not insignificant at all, and I'm not your enemy. And so then what happens, and this is how this finishes for us today, Therefore, verse 29, therefore those who were about to examine him immediately withdrew from him. And the tribune, the commander, also was afraid when he learned that he was a Roman and because he had bound him.
So they weren't even allowed to bind Romans.
Oh,
in
no.
Okay. So they've already broken a law, or one of the laws.
On the precipice of it. That's the whole wording. And verse 25. But when they stretched him out with leather straps, so they've stretched him out, put him in the leather binds. Right? Usually it was either stretched out like this or stretched around a pole, but it doesn't really matter which one it was. The same kind of thing that happened with Jesus, basically. When they'd stretched him out, so the beatings hadn't begun yet, but this is definitely a violation of his civic rights, if you want to use that modern terminology. But definitely it's nothing compared to them beating him. So Paul allows this to happen, but he stops them from beating him, not even for his own sake. And this is kind of, and I'll finish with this point, this is also Paul actually being very compassionate in one sense. He knows damn well, he knows full well that this entire proceeding is entirely illegal. He allows them to bind him, which is already illegal, but it's a comparative misdemeanor, quote unquote, compared to this greater crime that they were about to commit.
He ordered the chains, because that's what it says there. He was afraid because he had put him in chains.
That's what I'm saying. Yes, This is my point. And so that's why I'm saying when you read these, that you need to kind of understand the story, and you got to kind of picture it, not erroneously, but picture it how it's read. It's not licensed stale of, are you a Roman citizen? No, it's not a computer. It's not an AI talking. It's like you need to envision the shock, the wide eyes, the like this is like are you a Roman citizen? And then
like when this policeman racially profiled this coloured driver, pulled her over and said, "Can you identify yourself?" "Yes, I'm the State Attorney General."
Right.
"Oh, right, you're okay. Okay."
Yeah, and then sure, but that's what happens. Yeah, sure, good point, good comparison. Yeah, and so he allows that comparatively smaller crime to happen, so that he could prove this point. Right, so that he could prove the point, because if they hadn't, this has a greater shock value. Because he's allowed them, not that they know this, I'm talking about this is about the chess match going on that Paul's playing just here. He allows them, because he's allowed them to commit this infraction, and then he tells them, it immediately puts them on the back foot and him on the front foot. And he's in complete control here, right? Because they're going to be willing to give him the royal treatment after this, because they realise they just all committed a crime. And then Paul's going to show the compassion of, not getting them completely, proverbially crushed, so forth.
He could have pushed it.
Or he could have just allowed this whole thing to happen. He could have allowed himself to be whipped to a frenzy and then said, "Oh yeah, and by the way, I'm a Roman citizen," and that would have been their death sentence.
Yeah.
Right. So he doesn't do that. So he actually shows compassion by stopping the evil they're about to perpetrate. Which, by the way, just as another minor, it's not actually a minor point. I'm just making it a minor point here. This is the whole kind of language that you get, like in the Proverbs and other Old Testament literature, about the duty of God's people to stop the slaughter of the innocent and to end the bloodshed and blah blah blah. And that's why it's our modern sensibilities balk at the Israelite conquest of Canaan, and how could they have been told by a loving, compassionate God to conquer the land and to destroy the cities and for those who didn't flee, because they got the opportunity to flee, and those who didn't flee, that they'd be wiped out. Well, you clearly don't care about centuries of child sacrifice then. You clearly don't care about ending the horrors and the evils that were being conducted in pagan Canaanite culture, which was evil, barbaric, brutal, horrifically dark and chaotic and evil. And putting an end to that is an act of justice. It's the same thing I've said before about the concept of like apologizing for the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs or something, right? And I'm not Spanish, so I don't have a horse in the race. But the idea that it's a bad thing that no longer tens of thousands of people were being sacrificed at the temple of Tenochtitlan every single year, human beings who were literally born and bred in slavery for the purpose of being raised like cattle to be slaughtered and have their heart ripped out of their chest while they were living, right? The idea that that ending when the Spanish arrived is somehow something that Europeans should apologise for is hilarious. Or the British when they arrive in India, ending the practice of Sirat, which is where you have the ritual burning of a widow when her husband dies. And the British say, no, that's not going to happen anymore. And if you don't want to comply, then you will face justice, and the justice is going to come at the end of our guns. The idea that that's somehow some, evil, despotic European colonialism is just ridiculous.
Accused of being evil and despotic today.
No, yeah, it's failure to understand it's a failure to understand the context in which these things occur. And so in this same particular context here, Paul actually being merciful to them. He's stopping them from conducting an evil which would have got them killed by their own people, by the Romans. Right?
Which just made his day, the commander's day worse.
Yeah. Well, infinitely better than it would have otherwise been if they had whipped him. Yes, sure, I'm with you. Yes. No. So that's the concluding point. Is that
tricky, that's the word.
Yeah. The Romans obey the law here, and they actually make the moral decision. They were unknowingly breaking the law because they didn't know he was a Roman citizen. They should have, because he did mention it. But it's understandable why they didn't hear, or they didn't understand, or whatever the issue is. Especially if Paul's speaking with an accent, who knows? But whatever. Either way, though, as soon as they find out that he's a Roman citizen, they immediately stop.
Why didn't they just take it at face value? Why did they just believe Paul?
Probably because the fact that he's speaking Greek is a pretty good indication already.
Okay.
If he's just some random Jew trying to pull the wool over their eyes, why is he speaking Greek to us? That's not bona fide proof, but it's pretty good indication. It's kind of like how do you know this guy's an American?
Is it
because he's speaking with an American accent?
But is it also because he said I was from Tarsus as well? And
Yeah, he's told him from where he is. He's also speaking Greek,
Yes.
like the ducks are lining up.
Yeah.
There's nothing here that would indicate that he's completely
Okay. That is
telling you rubbish. Yeah, no, it's not. Yeah. They also could tell that he wouldn't have been. I suspect they would have known he was speaking Hebrew. They just don't know what's being said.
Yeah.
Because they would have known the difference between Hebrew and Aramaic, because they sound similar, but they're not.
Okay.
If you listen to English and Dutch, you know the difference. You may not have not. If you speak Dutch and don't speak English, you're not going to know what's being said, or vice versa. We speak English, but you don't speak Dutch, you're not going to know what's being said. But those two languages are very, very close to each other historically. Okay.
I still can't sometimes pick Dutch and German accents.
Yeah, sure, exactly. But that's what I'm saying, because they're both cousins. Yeah, they're similar. So they would have known he was speaking not Aramaic. In other words, he's speaking Hebrew. They just know what's being said. So they know this guy's got some prominence. He's also speaking Greek. He's also told us he's from Tarsus. The balance of probability is, or also, by the way, do we really want to run the risk of concluding that he's lying and we're going to beat him anyway, and then find out he's actually telling the truth? Right, we're not going to do that. Right.
Die.
So as soon as they find out that he said he's a citizen and there is some evidence to back that up, immediately they stop. They're not going to run that risk. So the Romans come out as reasonable and law-abiding. And then the next chapter you're about to see the people of God, in inverted commas, completely and absolutely make a mockery of the law of God. Because you're about to see basically a kangaroo court in chapter 23.
It's pretty heated.
Yeah.
Always.
Paul. This is where the intellectual chess match reaches its climax. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.